Eat the scraps you were given and pay the bill, or I will have my private security physically drag you out to the pavement where people like you belong." The vicious words echoed like a gunshot across the vaulted gold-leaf ceilings of the exclusive dining room. Preston, the meticulously tailored general manager, slammed both of his manicured hands down onto the pristine white tablecloth. The sheer force of the sudden impact sent the heavy sterling silver cutlery rattling aggressively against the fine bone china. He leaned in uncomfortably close, his face flushed with a venomous and unearned arrogance, exhaling the sharp scent of an overpriced bespoke cologne mixed with pure, unfiltered malice. He wanted her to flinch. He desperately wanted her to raise her voice, to lose her temper, and to give him the exact loud stereotype he was so eager to project onto her. Instead, Vivian sat in absolute terrifying silence. The visual and psychological contrast was staggering. Here was a man vibrating with theatrical fragile rage, weaponizing his hospitality title to assert dominance, standing over a 62-year-old black woman who remained entirely motionless. She did not break eye contact. She did not shrink back from the rancid, gray, biohazardous piece of spoiled fish he had intentionally served her as a twisted joke. The entire restaurant, filled to maximum capacity with the city elite, had gone completely dead silent. Dozens of privileged, wealthy eyes locked onto her isolated table. They were eagerly waiting for the spectacle, entirely complicit in the blatant systemic degradation happening right in front of them. Have you ever been humiliated in a room full of people who automatically assumed you were beneath them simply because of the color of your skin and the clothes on your back? Have you ever felt the crushing, suffocating weight of a dozen judgmental stares, dissecting your physical presence in a space they arrogantly believe they exclusively own? You know that exact feeling. The rapid tightening in your chest when a self-appointed gatekeeper looks at you and instantly decides, before you even speak a single word, that your financial net worth, your intellectual capacity, and your basic human dignity are somehow fundamentally inferior. They expect you to shatter under the pressure. They expect you to either shrink into pathetic nothingness or explode in desperate anger so they can immediately justify their toxic prejudice to the crowd. But what happens when you possess a systemic power so absolute, so quietly devastating that their petty display of verbal abuse becomes nothing more than a legally binding confession of their own impending corporate ruin? To fully comprehend the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic financial, professional, and legal mistake Preston was eagerly making in this exact fraction of a second, we need to go back to the very beginning. We need to carefully examine the precise chain of aggressive assumptions, racial profiling, and relentless microaggressions that led a middle management bully to threaten one of the most ruthless, heavily capitalized private equity titans on the entire eastern seaboard. Let us rewind exactly 42 minutes before those vile words permanently shattered the atmosphere of the dining room. Vivian Sterling inhaled the crisp autumn air of Manhattan, allowing the sharp chill to fill her lungs as a temporary distraction from the deep radiating ache in her right knee. At 62 years old, her mind operated with the lethal precision of a supercomputer, but her physical body occasionally demanded a brutal toll. She had just endured 90 agonizing minutes of intensive physical rehabilitation, a grueling session designed to repair the micro-tears in her cartilage after decades of relentless pacing across the polished marble floors of the world's most intimidating boardrooms. She was a self-made titan of private equity, a woman who had systematically dismantled and rebuilt corporate empires, turning failing conglomerates into highly liquid assets. Yet in this exact moment, standing on the uneven concrete of the city sidewalk, she simply wanted to sit down. She needed a moment of quiet solitude. To the untrained eye of the casual pedestrian, Vivian looked completely unremarkable, perhaps even out of place in this hyper-affluent zip code. She was dressed for comfort, wearing a simple, unbranded slate-gray tracksuit and a pair of worn-in dark running shoes. There were no flashy logos, no ostentatious hardware, and absolutely nothing to indicate her staggering net worth. To the arrogant and the uneducated, she looked like a tired woman who had just finished a community center aerobics class. They would see the soft matte fabric of her jacket and the relaxed fit of her pants, and immediately categorize her as someone struggling to pay rent. They would be catastrophically wrong. The slate-gray fabric draping her shoulders was not cotton or cheap polyester. It was a bespoke hand-spun vicuna and worsted cashmere blend, custom-tailored for her in a private atelier in Milan. The entire ensemble cost over $6,000, meticulously designed to provide maximum thermal regulation and comfort without drawing a single glance. Her dark running shoes, which appeared worn from the outside, were in fact custom-engineered orthopedics built around a three-dimensional mold of her feet, costing more than what most people earned in a month. This was the ultimate armor of silent wealth. Vivian Sterling had surpassed the need to prove her financial dominance through shiny objects decades ago. She existed in a stratosphere of wealth so absolute, so fundamentally unshakable that she no longer participated in the loud, desperate pageantry of the newly rich. She wore her billions invisibly wrapping herself in the quiet luxury of supreme comfort, while the rest of the world scrambled to project a facade of success. However, there was one singular microscopic detail that betrayed her true status, a detail only the most educated observer would ever catch. Resting quietly against her left wrist, partially hidden by the soft cashmere cuff of her sleeve, was a vintage platinum Patek Philippe complication watch. It was a masterpiece of Swiss horology featuring a subtle diamond bezel and a perpetual calendar, a timepiece so rare that it was never displayed in a catalog or sold to the general public. It was an invitation-only acquisition, a quiet nod to her membership in the global financial elite. Vivian slowly pulled back her sleeve and glanced at the sapphire crystal face of the watch. The sweeping second hand glided silently across the dial, a physical manifestation of the most valuable currency she possessed: time. She calculated the remaining window with cold mechanical efficiency. She had exactly 55 minutes before she was required to initiate a heavily encrypted multi-continent Zoom call. This was not a standard status update or a routine board meeting. She was the lead architect on a $4 billion hostile takeover of a massive international logistics firm. In less than an hour, she would authorize the final transfer of capital, effectively liquidating the existing management hierarchy and absorbing their assets into her own portfolio. The legal contracts were finalized, the mezzanine financing was secured, and the global press releases were already drafted, waiting only for her verbal command. The sheer gravity of the impending transaction required total mental clarity. She needed to review her strategic talking points, isolate the remaining vulnerabilities in the target company's defense, and prepare herself for the inevitable corporate warfare that would erupt the moment the acquisition went live. But before she could step onto that digital battlefield, she needed sustenance. Her blood sugar was dipping from the physical therapy, and the dull pain in her knee was beginning to cloud her focus. She needed a quiet table, a glass of pristine water, and a beautifully executed meal. She needed absolute peace for exactly 45 minutes. She turned her gaze toward the massive, imposing structure located halfway down the block, the Aurelia. It was widely considered the most exclusive, fiercely guarded dining institution in the city, a sanctuary explicitly designed to cater to the ultra-wealthy while aggressively repelling the general public. The architecture itself was a masterclass in psychological gatekeeping. The building sat set back from the sidewalk, forcing anyone who approached to cross a wide, intimidating expanse of imported Italian limestone. The entrance was flanked by towering monolithic columns of black marble that seemed to absorb the city light, projecting an aura of heavy, impenetrable authority. There were no welcoming signs, no menu boxes displayed in the windows, and absolutely no indications of what occurred behind its walls. The only marker of its existence was a small, understated brass plaque bolted perfectly flush against the stone, bearing a single, elegant crest. Heavy, solid brass double doors blocked the entrance, polished to a mirror shine, and devoid of exterior handles, ensuring that entry could only be granted from within. Thick, deep burgundy velvet ropes were strategically positioned to guide the approved guests, while simultaneously creating a physical and psychological barrier against the unwanted. As Vivian walked toward the entrance, her customized shoes making virtually no sound against the pavement, she observed the subtle theater of exclusion playing out around her. Two towering security men, dressed in immaculate, custom-tailored dark suits with discreet earpieces, stood entirely motionless by the velvet ropes. Their eyes continuously scanned the street, performing rapid, silent calculations of every passing pedestrian, assessing their clothing, their posture, and their perceived social value. They were the frontline soldiers of the establishment, specifically trained to identify and intercept anyone who did not look like they belonged to the ruling class. Beyond the heavy brass doors, through the reinforced soundproof glass panels, Vivian could see the warm amber glow of the dining room. She could faintly hear the hushed aristocratic murmurs of the city's elite, the soft clinking of baccarat crystal, and the low melodic hum of a live cellist playing in the corner. It was a curated bubble of absolute privilege, a space where billionaires, politicians, and socialites gathered to reinforce their own superiority, completely insulated from the harsh realities of the world outside. The Aurelia was not merely a restaurant. It was a fortress of systemic elitism, meticulously engineered to make the ordinary citizen feel profoundly small, inadequate, and entirely unwelcome. Vivian felt a familiar cold detachment as she approached the velvet rope. She had spent her entire professional life infiltrating and conquering rooms exactly like this one. She knew the unspoken rules, the hidden hierarchies, and the fragile, aggressive egos of the people who guarded these spaces. She knew that in a city built on the illusion of power, perception was often mistaken for reality. She adjusted the collar of her gray cashmere tracksuit, feeling the soft fabric brush against her neck. She did not reach for her phone. She did not adjust her posture to appear more commanding. She simply continued walking forward, her face a mask of serene, untouchable calm. The pain in her knee throbbed in time with her heartbeat, a persistent reminder of her own humanity. But she pushed it deep down into the recesses of her mind. The ticking of the Patek Philippe against her wrist seemed to amplify, counting down the seconds until her $4 billion execution order. She had 55 minutes left. She required a table. And she was utterly indifferent to the architectural intimidation, the silent judgments of the security guards, or the fragile, arrogant assumptions of anyone standing in her way. Vivian Sterling stepped onto the limestone entryway, prepared to cross the threshold, entirely unaware that she was about to face a level of blatant, unapologetic disrespect that would force her to unleash the full, devastating weight of her empire. The heavy, solid brass doors of the Aurelia swung open with a perfectly calibrated silence, welcoming Vivian Sterling into a sanctuary of aggressive exclusivity. The immediate transition from the chaotic ambient noise of the Manhattan pavement to the hyper-curated acoustic perfection of the grand foyer was jarring. The air inside was climate-controlled to an exact 70 degrees, infused with a subtle proprietary scent of crushed white lilies and polished mahogany. Every architectural detail in the entry hall was specifically engineered to intimidate. Vaulted ceilings coated in authentic gold leaf soared overhead, reflecting the warm amber glow of a massive baccarat crystal chandelier. The flooring was imported Calicut marble, cut so precisely that the seams were entirely invisible. It was a physical manifestation of generational wealth, a spatial barrier designed to separate the ruling elite from the rest of humanity. Vivian stepped entirely through the threshold, her custom orthopedics sinking slightly into the dense fibers of the antique Persian runner. Before she could even take a second step toward the maitre d' desk, a figure materialized from the shadows of the coat-check corridor, moving with the predatory swiftness of a man fiercely guarding his territory. Preston Kensington, the general manager of the Aurelia, physically stepped directly into her path. He did not approach her. He intercepted her. He positioned his body at a sharp, aggressive angle, intentionally blocking her forward momentum and forcing her to halt. Preston was a man in his early 40s, constructed entirely out of expensive fabrics and fragile arrogance. He was impeccably groomed, his ash-blonde hair swept back with surgical precision, not a single strand out of place. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit tailored so aggressively close to his body that it looked more like corporate armor than clothing. The lapels featured a hand-stitched Milanese buttonhole, and his silk tie was knotted with a flawless, exaggerated dimple. He radiated the overwhelming, cloying scent of an incredibly expensive oud cologne, a heavy, musky fragrance that aggressively invaded the personal space of anyone standing within a 5-foot radius. Preston looked down his nose at Vivian, slowly tilting his head to the side. It was a highly calculated microexpression, the universal physical gesture of condescending pity mixed with profound irritation. His pale blue eyes performed a rapid, ruthless scan of her physical appearance. He took in her black skin, her completely unbranded slate-gray tracksuit, and the slightly worn appearance of her dark running shoes. In less than a fraction of a second, his heavily prejudiced mind processed these visual data points and generated a deeply flawed conclusion. He did not see a billionaire titan of private equity. He did not see a woman who commanded international boardrooms and liquidated global conglomerates. He saw an aging black woman in cheap gym clothes who had somehow managed to wander past the exterior security detail. He raised his right hand, holding his palm out in a universal gesture to stop entirely dismissing her basic humanity. When he finally spoke, his voice was smooth, highly trained, and dripping with a venomous, patronizing sweetness. "Excuse me," he said, dragging the syllables out as if he were speaking to a deeply confused child. "I am afraid you have taken a wrong turn off the avenue. All commercial deliveries, courier drop-offs, and service personnel are strictly routed through the loading alley on 54th Street. You cannot be in the main dining foyer. You need to turn around and exit immediately." He over-enunciated every single word, moving his lips with exaggerated slowness, operating under the deeply racist assumption that she either lacked the intellectual capacity to understand standard English or was simply too uneducated to comprehend the rules of his establishment. He did not ask if he could help her. He did not inquire about a reservation. He issued a direct, humiliating command, fully expecting her to instantly apologize, lower her eyes, and retreat back out onto the street. Vivian did not retreat. She did not flinch. She simply stopped moving. The throbbing pain in her right knee pulsed sharply, a physical reminder of the grueling physical therapy session she had just endured. But she pushed the sensation deep down into the vault of her mind. She looked up at Preston, her expression completely unreadable. She did not offer him a defensive smile, nor did she contort her face into a mask of sudden rage. She simply observed him with the cold, detached clinical fascination of a scientist examining a particularly annoying insect under a microscope. She recognized his exact archetype immediately. Preston was a middle management gatekeeper, a man who possessed no actual wealth or systemic power of his own, but who derived his entire sense of self-worth from policing the boundaries of the wealthy elite he served. He was a glorified servant playing king. "I am not a courier," Vivian stated quietly. Her voice was steady, resonant, and entirely devoid of emotion. Her tone was a masterclass in executive control. "I am here to dine. I require a quiet table for one, preferably away from the main traffic flow. I have a limited window of time." Preston's perfectly sculpted face twitched. A sharp, ugly flash of cognitive dissonance crossed his features as his brain struggled to process her perfectly articulated, commanding response. The condescending smile vanished from his lips, instantly replaced by a tight, rigid grimace of profound offense. How dare she speak to him with such authority? How dare this woman, dressed in what he assumed was cheap polyester, stand in the foyer of his pristine dining room and issue a demand? His posture shifted from patronizing dismissal to active, aggressive hostility. He let out a short, breathy scoff, an abrasive sound meant to publicly belittle her. He took a half-step closer, intentionally invading her personal space, attempting to use his physical height to intimidate her into submission. "I believe you are fundamentally confused about the nature of this establishment," Preston said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the fake hospitality sweetness and replacing it with raw, unfiltered contempt. "This is not a casual drop-in diner. We operate strictly on a private reservation basis with an active waiting list extending 6 months in advance. We cater to a highly specific, highly curated clientele." He paused, allowing his gaze to slowly and deliberately rake over her gray tracksuit one more time, making his absolute disgust entirely obvious. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice into a sharp, venomous whisper, so the hostess standing 20 feet away could not hear the blatant discrimination. "And just to be absolutely clear, so there is no further misunderstanding on your part, we do not accept EBT here, ma'am. I strongly suggest you find a fast food establishment down the block before I am forced to call building security to escort you off the premises for loitering." There it was, the ultimate microaggression. The racially charged, economically degrading assumption weaponized to inflict maximum psychological damage. He had weaponized the concept of food stamps against a woman wearing a $6,000 bespoke cashmere ensemble solely because she was black and refused to cower in his presence. He wanted her to react. He was practically vibrating with the desperate desire for her to raise her voice, to cause a scene, to validate his toxic prejudice by giving him the loud, aggressive stereotype he had already projected onto her. If she yelled, he could play the victim. If she argued, he could easily justify throwing her out. Vivian Sterling gave him absolutely nothing. Her internal monologue remained flawlessly disciplined. She did not feel the hot flush of humiliation, nor did she feel the reckless surge of defensive anger. She felt only a cold, absolute clarity. She had spent 40 years navigating corporate boardrooms filled with arrogant men exactly like Preston. She had dismantled generational wealth funds and hostilely acquired massive conglomerates run by executives who had looked at her with the exact same thinly veiled disdain. She knew that anger was a completely useless emotion in the face of systemic prejudice. Anger was loud. Anger was messy. Wealth, true institutional wealth, was utterly silent. Vivian took a slow, deep breath, perfectly regulating her heart rate. She straightened her spine, pulling her shoulders back, subtly transforming her physical presence. The relaxed posture of a tired woman vanished instantly, replaced by the terrifying gravitational pull of a predatory apex executive. She did not utter a single word in her own defense. She did not attempt to educate him on the fabric of her clothing, nor did she threaten to have him fired. Explaining her wealth to a man like Preston would be an admission that she cared about his opinion, and she absolutely did not. Without breaking eye contact, Vivian slowly reached her right hand into the deep hidden pocket of her cashmere trousers. Preston tensed, his eyes darting toward her hand, a flicker of genuine apprehension crossing his face. She withdrew a single rectangular object and held it up between them, pinching it lightly between her index finger and thumb. It was not a standard credit card. It was not a bank card. It was a solid forged titanium medallion card, entirely matte black and devoid of any visible numbers, chips, or expiration dates. The metal was startlingly heavy, specifically engineered to feel substantial in the hand. The only marking on the entire surface of the card was a deeply laser-etched, highly intricate crest in the dead center, the exact same proprietary crest that was bolted to the brass plaque outside the building. This was the Aurelia Apex membership. It was a tier of access so stratospherically high, so heavily restricted, that it could not be purchased with money. It was granted exclusively to the foundational investors of the parent hospitality group, individuals whose net worth eclipsed the gross domestic product of small nations. Vivian held the heavy black titanium card perfectly still in the air between them, letting the ambient light of the crystal chandelier catch the laser-etched crest. She remained entirely silent, weaponizing the quiet atmosphere of the room, forcing Preston to confront his catastrophic error without giving him a single verbal cue to latch onto. Preston's pale blue eyes locked onto the black metal. For a fraction of a second, his brain simply refused to compute the visual information. The cognitive dissonance was absolute. He stared at the card, then darted his eyes back up to her face, then frantically back down to the titanium rectangle. The physiological reaction was instantaneous and brutal to watch. The color completely drained from Preston's perfectly tanned face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. The arrogant, condescending smirk did not just fade, it shattered completely, collapsing into a mask of visceral, reluctant shock. His breathing hitched a sharp, ragged intake of air tearing through the silence. He knew exactly what that card was. He had been trained on the protocol for the apex tier during his executive onboarding, heavily instructed that anyone holding that specific piece of black metal was considered absolute royalty, superseding all reservations, all dress codes, and all standard operating procedures. In his 5 years of managing the Aurelia, he had never actually seen one in person. A heavy, suffocating silence stretched between them. The power dynamic in the grand foyer violently inverted. Preston suddenly realized that he had just threatened to call security on a woman who functionally owned the ground he was standing on. He had just accused an Apex member of attempting to use food stamps in his dining room. Vivian continued to hold the card in the air, her face an unreadable mask of cold authority. She watched the sheer panic flood his nervous system. She watched the arrogant gatekeeper realize that the gate he was so fiercely guarding was completely unlocked for the very person he was trying to destroy. Preston swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet foyer. He visibly trembled, the expensive fabric of his charcoal suit shifting slightly as he forcefully broke his own aggressive stance. He took a slow, deeply reluctant step backward, physically yielding the space he had just tried to aggressively claim. He opened his mouth to speak desperately, trying to formulate a backpedaling apology, trying to somehow salvage the catastrophic mistake he had just made. But his vocal cords completely failed him. Vivian finally lowered her hand, slipping the heavy titanium card back into her pocket with a smooth, dismissive motion. She stepped forward, effectively forcing Preston to step completely aside or risk being physically bumped out of the way. "I require a table," Vivian repeated. Her voice was exactly the same volume, exactly the same pitch as before, cold level and utterly terrifying. "Lead the way." Preston pivoted on his expensive Italian leather heel, his entire body rigid with suppressed, vibrating fury. He had been thoroughly humiliated, forced into total submission by a simple piece of black titanium, but his fragile ego immediately sought a new method of aggressive retaliation. If he could not deny Vivian Sterling entry into his fiercely guarded fortress, he would ensure her physical experience inside was as degrading and profoundly uncomfortable as humanly possible. He turned his back to her and began the long walk out of the grand foyer and into the main dining room of the Aurelia, moving with a stiff, hostile, militant march. Vivian followed him silently, her posture maintaining the terrifying, effortless grace of a corporate apex predator. The transition from the quiet foyer to the main floor was a jarring plunge into a sprawling, multi-tiered amphitheater of extreme wealth. The space was an architectural masterpiece of spatial hierarchy, heavily draped in velvet, and bathed in the warm, golden afternoon sunlight pouring through massive floor-to-ceiling arched windows. Intricate floral arrangements of rare white orchids towered over pristine linen tablecloths, while a live string quartet played a low, melodic classical arrangement in the center of the room. The restaurant was populated almost entirely by the city's white aristocratic elite. Men in tailored worsted wool suits and women draped in seasonal European couture leaned intimately over their plates, conducting quiet, high-stakes conversations regarding hedge funds and real estate acquisitions. As Vivian followed Preston across the imported hardwood floor, a palpable, heavy silence began to ripple aggressively through the room. It was not a sudden hush, but a slow, creeping cessation of ambient noise. One by one, the wealthy patrons stopped speaking. Heavy silver forks hovered motionless over delicate porcelain plates. Crystal wine glasses were slowly lowered to the tables. Hundreds of privileged, highly judgmental eyes locked onto Vivian. They saw a black woman wearing an unbranded slate-gray tracksuit, walking confidently through their exclusive sanctuary, and their collective reaction was a toxic, visible mixture of shock, confusion, and deep-seated aristocratic offense. They stared at her with the unfiltered audacity of people who believed they owned the very air in the room, silently demanding to know how this demographic anomaly had breached their perimeter. Preston intentionally bypassed the beautiful, highly coveted sunlit tables situated near the center of the room, tables that were clearly vacant and fully prepped for service. Instead, he marched Vivian straight toward the absolute worst section of the restaurant, a designated dead zone specifically reserved by management for undesirable walk-ins or low-tier reservations. It was a dark, cramped corner located aggressively close to the heavy swinging metal doors of the main industrial kitchen. The lighting here was incredibly dim and unflattering, completely lacking the warm amber glow of the main floor. The air in this corner was thick with the chaotic, abrasive sounds of culinary production. The loud, aggressive shouting of stressed line cooks, the sharp clattering of heavy industrial pans, and the constant rhythmic thud of the metal service doors violently swinging open and closed. Preston stopped abruptly and gestured rigidly toward an incredibly small, unstable two-top table wedged awkwardly against a thick structural support column. He did not pull out her chair. He did not offer a polite, mandatory hospitality smile. He simply stood there, radiating hostile compliance, waiting for her to accept the deliberate physical insult of the segregated seating assignment. Vivian understood the systemic tactic immediately. It was a pathetic, transparent display of petty retaliation, a desperate attempt by a weak man to reassert his dominance by controlling her physical environment. She did not complain. She did not demand to speak to a supervisor because she functionally owned the supervisor's supervisor. She calmly stepped forward and seated herself, adjusting the crease of her bespoke cashmere trousers with absolute, unbreakable composure. Her complete lack of emotional reaction infuriated him even more. Directly adjacent to Vivian's assigned corner, separated by less than 2 feet of negative space, sat a woman who perfectly embodied the exact demographic makeup and toxic culture of the Aurelia. Her name was Caroline, a highly influential local socialite whose entire existence was predicated on maintaining strict socio-economic and racial boundaries. Caroline was a masterclass in aggressive, weaponized privilege. She wore a pristine white silk crepe designer dress that starkly contrasted with the dim lighting of the dark corner. Her blonde hair was professionally blown out into a flawless, stiff helmet of artificial volume, and her wrists were stacked with heavy diamond tennis bracelets. Resting on the empty leather chair directly beside her was a matte white Himalayan crocodile Birkin bag, an incredibly rare status symbol worth more than a typical suburban mortgage. The exact moment Vivian sat down at her table, Caroline's entire physical posture drastically shifted. She visibly recoiled, pulling her shoulders back and pressing herself defensively against the tufted leather upholstery of her booth. Her pale blue eyes darted toward Vivian, sweeping over the gray tracksuit with a look of unfiltered, visceral disgust. Caroline immediately reached her manicured hands across the table, snatching the heavy leather handles of her Birkin bag and violently dragging it closer to her own body, placing it securely on her lap. It was an overtly theatrical, deeply offensive physical gesture, implying that her property was suddenly in imminent danger of being stolen by the black woman sitting next to her. She then leaned aggressively across the table toward her husband, a balding finance executive who was silently cutting his premium Wagyu beef, and began to speak in a highly projected, intentional whisper. It was the specific kind of acoustic whisper perfectly calibrated to be overheard by the exact target of the insult. "I simply cannot believe the absolute state of this place," Caroline hissed, her voice dripping with venomous, unchecked elitism. "Management is apparently letting just anyone walk through the doors these days. It is completely unacceptable. We pay astronomical membership dues to avoid this exact demographic of people. This used to be a highly respectable establishment, Richard. Now it looks like a public bus terminal." Her husband offered a weak, non-committal nod, entirely complicit in her blatant racial profiling, cowardly refusing to make eye contact with Vivian. Caroline intentionally let out a loud, dramatic sigh of exasperation, shifting her body weight to angle her back aggressively toward Vivian's table. It was a textbook execution of the Karen protocol, a highly synchronized deployment of microaggressions, physical intimidation, and loud, performative victimhood designed entirely to make Vivian feel as though her mere existence in the room was an act of hostile contamination. Vivian Sterling, whose personal liquid capital could comfortably bankrupt Caroline's entire generational family trust fund before the appetizer course arrived, remained entirely unfazed. She mentally categorized Caroline as a completely irrelevant variable, a minor acoustic annoyance no different than the clanking dishes emerging from the kitchen. As Vivian settled into the deeply uncomfortable wooden chair, a new figure approached the table, momentarily breaking the oppressive, toxic tension of the immediate area. It was a young waiter named Elijah. He was a sharp, impeccably groomed black man in his early 20s, dressed flawlessly in the starched white uniform jacket, black vest, and perfectly tied Windsor knot required of the junior service staff. Elijah moved with a quiet, highly practiced grace, carrying a heavy silver tray holding a crystal carafe of ice water. As he stepped up to Vivian's table, their eyes naturally met. In that brief, silent fraction of a second, an entire complex conversation occurred without a single word being spoken. It was the unspoken, universal communication between two black individuals navigating a fiercely hostile, predominantly white corporate environment. Elijah's eyes conveyed a profound mixture of deep respect, silent solidarity, and a very subtle warning caution. He had watched Preston deliberately march her to the worst table in the house. He had clearly heard Carolyn's loudly projected venomous whispers. He immediately recognized the systemic indignity being inflicted upon her, and his professional posture softened with a genuine protective warmth. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Elijah said, his voice a soothing, respectful baritone that completely ignored the toxic atmosphere aggressively swirling around them. "My name is Elijah, and it is my absolute privilege to take care of you today. May I pour you some water while you look over the menu?" It was a simple standard hospitality greeting, but in the context of the suffocating prejudice of the Aurelia, it felt like an act of profound grace and defiance. Before Vivian could even nod her appreciation, a dark looming shadow fell violently across the table. Preston materialized from the main walkway, moving with aggressive, predatory speed. He stepped violently between Elijah and the table, using his physical bulk to completely cut the young waiter off from Vivian. Preston's face was a mask of cold, bureaucratic fury. He glared at Elijah, his eyes narrowing with a highly specific, weaponized disdain reserved exclusively for his subordinate staff of color. "What exactly do you think you are doing, Elijah?" Preston demanded, his voice dropping into a sharp, threatening register that cut through the kitchen noise. "I did not assign you to this section. You have active tables in the main dining room that require your immediate maintenance. Return to your designated station immediately." Elijah froze, his jaw tightening slightly under the harsh fluorescent light of the corner. He maintained his professional composure, balancing the silver tray perfectly, but the subtle look of solidarity he had just shared with Vivian was instantly replaced by the rigid defensive posture of a man desperately trying to protect his livelihood from a hostile manager. "Sir, I saw the guest was seated and waiting for service, so I took the initiative to bring water." Elijah responded evenly, keeping his tone carefully neutral to avoid giving Preston any operational ammunition for disciplinary action. "I do not pay you to take initiative," Preston snapped back, leaning in dangerously close to the young waiter, intentionally invading his personal space to establish dominance. "I pay you to follow direct orders. I will be handling this specific table personally to ensure there are no operational issues. Hand me the carafe and step away. Now." The dark implication in Preston's voice was incredibly loud and deliberately offensive. By aggressively dismissing Elijah and claiming the table himself, Preston was communicating a clear, highly hostile message directly to Vivian. He was telling her that she was a high-risk problem, a potential security threat that required the direct, unblinking supervision of the general manager. He wanted to ensure that she received exactly the type of degraded service he deemed appropriate for her demographic, completely free from any sympathetic or respectful treatment from a fellow black employee. Elijah hesitated for a painful fraction of a second, his dark eyes flickering toward Vivian with a profound, silent apology. He carefully placed the heavy crystal water carafe directly onto Preston's outstretched hand, gave a short, rigid bow of his head toward Vivian, and quickly retreated toward the main dining floor. Preston slowly turned back to Vivian, placing his perfectly manicured hands flat on the edge of her table, leaning over her with a menacing, deeply artificial smile. "Now then," Preston said, his voice dripping with condescending authority and unchecked malice. "Since you insisted on occupying space in my dining room, let us see if we can find something on this menu that you can actually afford to purchase without causing any trouble." Vivian Sterling did not grant Preston the satisfaction of a verbal reaction to his incredibly offensive provocation. She simply bypassed his toxic presence entirely, directing her focus to the heavy leather-bound menu resting on the table. Her eyes scanned the meticulously curated list of exorbitant culinary offerings, completely ignoring the hovering general manager. She operated with the serene, untouchable confidence of a woman who routinely evaluated multi-billion-dollar corporate portfolios before her morning coffee. After a few seconds of absolute deliberate silence, she smoothly closed the menu and set it aside. She looked precisely at the knot of Preston's expensive silk tie, intentionally refusing to validate his authority by making eye contact. "I will have the signature Chilean sea bass," Vivian stated calmly. Her voice was a masterclass in executive detachment, projecting the exact tone one might use to order a junior analyst to reprint a flawed quarterly report. "And I require a pot of your finest Earl Grey tea steeped for exactly 4 minutes. Nothing else." Preston snatched the menu from the table with a sharp, aggressive motion, his jaw clenching so tightly that the muscles in his face twitched under the harsh lighting. He offered a tight, completely insincere bow of his head, turned on his heel, and marched back toward the kitchen doors. He was a man violently rejected by the very person he was desperately trying to intimidate, and that rejection festered instantly into a malicious, vindictive, absolute rage. While Vivian waited in the oppressive segregated corner of the dining room, the true intended experience of the Aurelia unfolded flawlessly at the adjacent table. A team of 3 highly trained service staff descended upon Caroline and her husband, moving with the synchronized grace of a theatrical ballet. The lead server gently placed a massive, gleaming silver cloche in the center of their table. With a dramatic sweeping flourish, he lifted the silver dome, releasing a magnificent cloud of aromatic steam that instantly filled the surrounding air. The sensory display was absolutely breathtaking. It was a colossal, pristine Maine lobster split perfectly down the center and roasted to an absolute masterpiece of culinary perfection. The shell was a brilliant, vibrant crimson, glistening under the ambient light of the dining room. The meat inside was a flawless, pearlescent white, plump and tender, lightly charred at the edges from the intense heat of the wood-fired oven. Small porcelain ramekins of drawn, clarified European butter rested beside the massive crustacean heavily infused with shaved black winter truffles and roasted garlic. Delicately placed sprigs of fresh microthyme and edible gold leaf garnished the perimeter of the heavy bone china plate. The rich, decadent aroma of the truffle butter and the sweet oceanic scent of the premium lobster aggressively permeated the space, an olfactory declaration of supreme wealth and untouchable privilege. Caroline let out a loud, performative gasp of delight, deliberately projecting her voice so that Vivian could hear her absolute satisfaction. She picked up a heavy silver seafood fork and delicately extracted a massive steaming piece of the tender claw meat, dragging it slowly through the golden pool of truffle butter. The auditory crunch of the shell, the soft clinking of the crystal wine glasses, and the fragrant mouth-watering steam created a profound atmosphere of luxury. It was a vivid, undeniable physical manifestation of the exact treatment deemed appropriate for the white aristocratic elite in this specific room. Exactly 14 minutes later, the heavy industrial doors of the main kitchen swung open with a violent, jarring metallic crash. Preston emerged, and he was completely alone. He did not use a silver serving tray. He did not utilize the assistance of the junior service staff. He carried a single covered plate directly in his bare hands, marching toward Vivian's table with a stiff, predatory gait. His eyes were locked entirely onto her, burning with a dark, deeply malicious anticipation. Preston stopped abruptly at her table and practically slammed the ceramic plate down onto the white linen tablecloth. He did not offer a polite description of the dish. He simply reached out and yanked the metal cover off with aggressive force. The assault on the senses was instantaneous and absolutely revolting. A heavy, suffocating cloud of putrid air rolled violently off the plate, entirely eclipsing the delicate aroma of the truffle butter from the neighboring table. It was the sharp, undeniable stench of maritime decay, a pungent, ammonia-rich odor that aggressively burned the lining of the nostrils. It was the smell of biological rot of seafood that had been left entirely exposed to warm air for days, heavily bordering on a biohazardous state. Vivian looked down at the plate. The visual presentation was equally horrifying. The $200 Chilean sea bass, which was globally renowned for its firm, snowy white flesh and delicate flakiness, had been replaced by something entirely unrecognizable. The fillet sitting in front of her was a sickly, necrotic shade of yellow and gray. The texture was visually gelatinous and severely compromised, the flesh physically collapsing under its own weight, dissolving into a mushy, coagulated pile in the center of the dish. A bizarre separated pool of oily liquid seeped out from underneath the rotting fish, staining the pristine white tablecloth with a greasy, discolored residue. But the culinary desecration did not end with the rotting protein. The physical plate itself was a deliberate, highly calculated insult. The porcelain rim was heavily smeared with greasy fingerprints and crusted, dried remnants of a dark sauce, clearly indicating that the plate had been pulled directly from the dirty dish return station and never washed. This was not a simple mistake by an overwhelmed line cook. This was not a minor oversight in inventory management. This was a highly coordinated, intentional act of psychological and physical violence. Preston had deliberately bypassed the active service line, walked directly to the kitchen discard bins, and manually plated rotting, contaminated waste to serve to a black woman he deemed entirely unworthy of basic human dignity. He had weaponized the food itself, creating a situation so profoundly degrading that he fully expected her to completely lose her mind. He stood towering over the table, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his face contorted into a smug, victorious smirk. He was waiting for the explosion. He was waiting for her to scream, to flip the table, to give him the angry, unhinged reaction that would perfectly validate his deeply ingrained racist biases. Vivian Sterling looked at the rotting pile of biological waste on her plate. She slowly inhaled a shallow breath through her mouth to avoid the nauseating stench of the ammonia. Her heart rate remained a perfectly steady resting rhythm. Her facial expression did not shift even a fraction of a millimeter. She did not feel the sudden blinding rush of humiliation or defensive rage that Preston so desperately wanted to provoke. Instead, her brilliant, highly analytical mind instantly shifted into the cold, clinical territory of corporate litigation. She did not look at the plate as an insult. She looked at it as a massive, catastrophic legal liability. She systematically calculated the specific health code violations present on the ceramic dish. Storing and serving severely compromised seafood was a direct violation of the federal food safety regulations. Presenting it on unwashed, contaminated dishware constituted gross negligence. Doing so specifically to a patron based on extreme racial profiling elevated the act from a municipal code violation to a massive, highly actionable civil rights lawsuit. Preston thought he was delivering a personal insult. Vivian knew he had just handed her the absolute legal authority to completely dismantle his entire professional existence. Vivian slowly picked up her pristine white linen napkin from her lap and delicately dabbed the corners of her mouth. She placed the napkin neatly on the table, folded her hands together, and finally looked up at the general manager. "Preston," Vivian said softly. Her voice was incredibly quiet, forcing him to lean in slightly to hear her over the ambient noise of the dining room. Her tone was the absolute epitome of the silent wealth persona. It was entirely polite, utterly devoid of emotion, and chillingly precise. "This fish is severely compromised. It is in an active state of biological decomposition. The flesh is completely rancid, and the plate itself is contaminated with unwashed residue. This is not fit for human consumption. I am respectfully asking you to remove this biohazardous material from my table immediately and to completely strike the charge from my bill. I will just take the tea." The quiet, highly professional rejection completely short-circuited Preston's aggressive expectations. He had prepared himself for a loud, chaotic confrontation. He had primed his adrenaline for a screaming match. He had absolutely no psychological defense against a woman who calmly analyzed his malicious attack as if she were pointing out a minor clerical error on a spreadsheet. Her total lack of emotional reactivity was an absolute rejection of his power. It made him feel incredibly small, deeply foolish, and violently insecure. The smug smirk instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a dark, ugly flush of pure, unchecked rage. If she refused to give him the private emotional explosion he wanted, he would forcefully manufacture a public spectacle. He would use the power of the crowd to crush her into submission. Preston took a half step back from the table, physically opening his posture to the rest of the dining room. He took a deep breath, puffed out his chest, and intentionally increased the volume of his voice by several decibels. He wanted the tables around them to stop eating. He wanted Caroline to hear every single word. He wanted the entire elite ecosystem of the Aurelia to serve as his personal jury. "Excuse me," Preston projected loudly, his voice echoing sharply against the heavy architectural columns of the segregated corner. "Did you just accuse my Michelin star kitchen of serving you garbage?" The acoustic shift was immediate. The soft murmurs of the surrounding tables abruptly ceased. Several wealthy patrons physically turned in their chairs to watch the confrontation unfold. Caroline paused halfway through chewing her luxurious lobster, her eyes widening with eager predatory delight. The trap was set and the audience was fully engaged. Preston sneered, gesturing aggressively toward the rotting plate with an open palm. "There is absolutely nothing wrong with that dish. That is our signature line, caught sea bass prepared with a highly complex traditional fermented glaze. The texture you are so completely ignorant of is exactly how it is supposed to be presented in fine dining establishments." He took another step forward, looming over Vivian, his voice dripping with venomous, condescending authority. He was actively employing textbook gaslighting, attempting to manipulate the reality of the situation by using specialized culinary vocabulary to confuse and humiliate her. "But I suppose I should not be surprised." Preston continued, his voice projecting louder, ensuring his words carried across the silent room. "If your palate is entirely conditioned to consuming heavily processed, deep-fried fast food from a drive-through window, the nuances of true haute cuisine would obviously be completely lost on you. You simply do not possess the necessary sophistication to understand what you are looking at." The racist implications were incredibly loud, violently echoing through the dining room. He was publicly declaring that because she was a black woman in a gray tracksuit, her culinary background was inherently cheap, unhealthy, and deeply inferior. He was actively weaponizing the wealthy white audience around them, seeking their silent approval to degrade her. He was framing her as an uneducated, combative outsider who was too stupid to appreciate the elite culture she had somehow managed to infiltrate. Caroline let out a sharp, highly audible snicker of agreement from the adjacent table. She leaned over to her husband, whispering loudly enough for the entire section to hear. "I knew it." She probably thought she was ordering fish sticks. This is exactly why they need to strictly enforce the dress code. The tension in the corner of the dining room reached an absolute boiling point. The air felt incredibly thick, heavy with the suffocating weight of systemic prejudice and public humiliation. Preston stood tall, his chest puffed out deeply, satisfied with his theatrical performance. He had successfully cornered her. He had the complete backing of his wealthy patrons. He had insulted her intelligence, her background, and her right to exist in his space. He firmly believed he had completely won the encounter. He firmly believed she was entirely powerless. Vivian Sterling sat perfectly still beneath the crushing weight of the public spectacle. She did not break eye contact with Preston. She simply looked at him, absorbing the absolute totality of his arrogance. The rubber band of the conflict had been stretched to its absolute agonizing maximum limit. The psychological pressure in the room was completely unbearable. And as she slowly reached her hand toward the pocket of her tailored cashmere trousers to retrieve her encrypted cellular device, Preston Kensington was entirely oblivious to the fact that he had just aggressively triggered his own total financial and professional annihilation. Exactly 40 feet away from the suffocating, highly toxic tension of the segregated corner, sitting in a highly coveted curved leather booth in the exact center of the main dining room, sat a woman named Maya. She was a 26-year-old senior digital crisis strategist for a massive global public relations firm. Her entire professional career was predicated on analyzing real-time optics, identifying aggressive brand escalation, and understanding the devastating, uncontrollable velocity of viral societal outrage. Maya had been quietly and meticulously observing the spatial dynamics of the restaurant for the past 20 minutes. She had watched Preston intentionally march the solitary black woman past dozens of empty, beautiful tables to the absolute worst physical location in the building. She had noted the deeply offensive theatrical body language of the wealthy socialite Caroline, who aggressively clutched her designer handbag as if her life were in imminent danger. And when Preston emerged from the swinging metal kitchen doors carrying a plate of visibly rotting biohazardous waste, with his bare hands, Maya's professional instincts violently ignited. Maya did not intervene physically. She understood that in situations of overt systemic racial profiling, raw physical confrontation often played directly into the hands of the arrogant oppressor. Preston desperately wanted a loud, chaotic incident to justify his deeply ingrained prejudice. He wanted the black woman to scream, to flip the table, to cause a scene so he could immediately call the local authorities and completely control the official narrative of the altercation. Maya knew the only way to completely dismantle that highly manipulative power dynamic was absolute, undeniable high-definition documentation. She slowly reached across the pristine white linen tablecloth and picked up her advanced smartphone. She smoothly leaned the device against the heavy base of a crystal water goblet, creating a perfectly stabilized, completely unobstructed camera angle. She carefully adjusted the optical focal length, zooming directly past the oblivious wealthy patrons and locking the digital lens entirely onto the incredibly stark visual contrast between Preston's aggressive looming posture and Vivian's absolute terrifying stillness. With a single deliberate tap of her perfectly manicured finger, Maya initiated a live video broadcast on a massive global social media platform. The initial digital interface populated slowly at first. The screen displayed a live viewer count of 12, then 45, then exactly 100 concurrent watchers. In the physical reality of the dining room, Preston took a deep theatrical breath, puffing his tailored chest out to its maximum physical capacity. He was completely intoxicated by his own perceived authority. He firmly believed that the four heavy architectural walls of the Aurelia were an impenetrable fortress, a private corporate kingdom where his deeply ingrained prejudices were permanently protected by the wealth status and silent complicity of the aristocratic audience surrounding him. He heavily projected his voice intentionally, ensuring that his cruel, condescending gaslighting about fast food and unsophisticated palates echoed sharply against the acoustic panels of the vaulted ceiling. He was playing entirely to the physical room. He was seeking the silent nodding approval of Caroline and the other wealthy white patrons who were actively enjoying the public degradation of an outsider. He had absolutely no idea he was now playing to a global digital auditorium. On Maya's glowing screen, the highly optimized content algorithm instantly registered the sharp, aggressive audio tone of Preston's voice and the visually compelling, highly polarizing optics of the physical confrontation. The algorithmic machinery rapidly categorized the live broadcast as an escalating social justice conflict and instantly began pushing the live video feed to thousands of mobile devices across the entire country. The viewer count metric in the top corner of the screen began to spin with terrifying exponential velocity. 300 viewers, 850 viewers, 1,200 viewers, 2,000 concurrent viewers. The chat interface, which had been completely dormant just seconds prior, suddenly erupted into a blindingly fast, continuous waterfall of scrolling text. The digital audience immediately recognized the highly toxic, undeniable reality of the situation that the wealthy physical audience in the restaurant was actively trying to ignore and validate. Real people sitting in their homes, in their office cubicles, and on their lunch breaks suddenly became an instant, massive, highly vocal jury. The comments flew across the digital interface faster than the human eye could comfortably track, creating a massive wave of collective societal fury. Did he really just say that to her? I cannot believe the sheer audacity of this manager. Look at the plate he just put in front of her. That fish is literally gray and actively rotting. Oh my God, he is serving her actual garbage. Someone needs to call the federal health department right now. Look at the blonde Karen at the next table laughing at her. This whole restaurant is completely toxic. He is using aggressive microaggressions to try and trigger an emotional response. She is handling this like an absolute queen. Look at her posture. Why is he standing so close to her? That is textbook physical intimidation. I would have flipped that table completely upside down by now. This is a massive civil rights violation caught on pristine, high-definition video. They think they can treat us like this because they think nobody is watching them. Well, we are watching now. The digital crowd provided instantaneous, overwhelming validation of Vivian's severe mistreatment. They easily saw right through Preston's highly manipulative, gaslighting culinary vocabulary. They did not see a sophisticated restaurant manager upholding the strict standards of haute cuisine. They saw a weak, racist middle management bully attempting to publicly humiliate a black woman who was simply trying to eat a quiet meal in peace. Maya quickly typed a pinned comment at the bottom of the broadcast to provide immediate context to the thousands of new viewers flooding into the stream. The pinned text read, "Elitist manager serves rotting biohazardous food to black patron and loudly claims she has a fast food palate." This single sentence acted as highly combustible digital fuel, pouring absolute gasoline onto the algorithmic fire. Back in the suffocating, oppressive physical reality of the dining corner, Vivian Sterling remained a fortress of absolute untouchable calm. She did not raise her voice to match Preston's loud theatrical projection. She did not look around the dining room to seek the approval, the validation, or the mercy of the wealthy patrons who were actively enjoying her public degradation. Her profound silence was a highly engineered psychological weapon of mass destruction, and she was currently wielding it with lethal surgical precision. Every single second she remained perfectly composed, she forced Preston to escalate his own aggressive, irrational behavior, unknowingly providing the live digital broadcast with more and more undeniable, legally actionable evidence of his gross professional misconduct. The pacing of the entire room began to violently accelerate, driven by two completely different but parallel ticking clocks. The real-world clock was relentlessly ticking down in Vivian's mind. She had precisely 18 minutes remaining before she was strictly required to initiate a highly encrypted $4 billion corporate acquisition call. Her time was literally worth millions of dollars per minute, and Preston was actively wasting it. The second clock was the digital momentum of the live stream. The viewer count violently smashed through the 3,000 mark, quickly accelerating past 4,000, and was rapidly approaching 5,000 concurrent viewers. The live stream was officially achieving viral escape velocity. This was no longer a localized, isolated dispute contained within a highly restricted Manhattan dining room. It was rapidly evolving into a massive, uncontrolled public relations catastrophe for the parent hospitality conglomerate that owned the Aurelia. The corporate brand equity, which had taken decades of careful curation and hundreds of millions of dollars in marketing capital to build, was currently hemorrhaging value with every single arrogant syllable that Preston spat into the ambient air. The highly sensitive acoustic architecture of the restaurant, originally designed to allow wealthy patrons to hear the gentle live string quartet, was ironically capturing Preston's loud, discriminatory declarations perfectly for the smartphone microphone. The sharp ambient noise of the industrial kitchen clattering in the background served as a chaotic, stressful soundtrack to his impending professional doom. Caroline leaned aggressively closer to her husband at the adjacent table, her face flushed with cruel elitist excitement. She whispered loudly enough for the microphone to easily capture her voice, stating that people who cannot afford proper dining etiquette should be forcibly removed by security. She was entirely unaware that her smug, highly racist reaction was currently being broadcast to a live audience that was actively screen recording every single frame of her face. The digital tension was completely boiling over. The chat interface was screaming for immediate real-world intervention, begging for someone in the restaurant to step in, demanding to know the exact geographic location of the building so they could aggressively flood the corporate switchboards and ruin the establishment's digital rating. Preston Kensington firmly believed he possessed total, absolute control over the narrative of the room. He believed he was the undisputed architect of Vivian's humiliation. He shifted his physical weight, leaning closer to the table, completely feeding off the silent complicity and elitist energy of the white patrons surrounding him. But the devastating, catastrophic reality, completely invisible to his arrogant eyes, was that he was merely a loud, pathetic, deeply ignorant actor performing the lead role in a high-definition documentary of his own ultimate destruction. Vivian Sterling was not a powerless victim trapped in his establishment. She was the absolute, undisputed authority of the situation. She sat perfectly still in her bespoke $6,000 cashmere tracksuit, silently absorbing his verbal abuse, meticulously cataloging every single health code violation, every discriminatory remark, and every threatening posture. She was fully aware of the terrifying systemic financial power resting quietly inside her pocket. The psychological rubber band of the central conflict was stretching tighter and tighter, pulled violently in one direction by the real-world aggression of the arrogant manager, and pulled in the exact opposite direction by the explosive, compounding, completely unrestrained outrage of the massive digital crowd. The atmosphere inside the dining room was incredibly thick, heavy, and highly combustible. 5,000 people across the globe were now holding their collective breath, watching intensely through the glowing glass lens of a smartphone screen, waiting for the exact inevitable moment that the tension would finally shatter. They were waiting for the breaking point. They were waiting for the loud, aggressive villain to finally push the quiet, composed woman exactly 1 inch too far. Vivian Sterling subtly shifted the angle of her left wrist, allowing the sapphire crystal face of her vintage Patek Philippe to catch the harsh, unflattering light bleeding out from the industrial kitchen. The sweeping complication hand glided silently across the dial with absolute mechanical indifference to the toxic social theater unfolding around it. She performed a rapid clinical calculation in her mind. She had exactly 20 minutes. In precisely 1,200 seconds, she was contractually obligated to initiate a heavily encrypted multi-continent digital conference call to finalize the $4 billion hostile acquisition of a global logistics conglomerate. The executives on the other end of that impending connection were currently sitting in pristine boardrooms in London and Tokyo, sweating through their custom-tailored suits, waiting for her singular, terrifying verbal authorization to liquidate their existing corporate structure. The sheer magnitude of the global capital waiting on her command stood in breathtaking, almost comical contrast to the pathetic, localized temper tantrum currently being thrown by a middle-management restaurant employee holding a plate of rotting fish. Her time was functionally valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars per minute. Preston Kensington was actively burning her most precious commodity, and his profound ignorance regarding the true cost of his actions was about to become his permanent financial ruin. Vivian lowered her wrist, her posture remaining perfectly straight, her shoulders relaxed in the bespoke slate-gray cashmere. She looked down at the biohazardous material slowly oozing a greasy, separated fluid onto the pristine white tablecloth. She did not raise her voice. She did not display a single fraction of an emotional response. She simply extended her right hand, placing her index and middle fingers precisely against the greasy, unwashed rim of the ceramic plate. With a slow, deliberate, and entirely unbothered motion, she physically pushed the plate away from her. The heavy porcelain scraped sharply against the thick linen fabric, a highly abrasive acoustic friction that cut directly through the suffocating tension of the segregated dining corner. "I will not consume biological waste," Vivian stated. Her voice was an absolute masterclass in executive lethality. It was incredibly quiet, forcing Preston to strain slightly to hear her, but it carried the devastating weight of an unappealable corporate mandate. "And I will absolutely not subsidize your gross operational negligence. You will permanently remove this health code violation from my table, and you will bring me the check for the tea. I am entirely finished communicating with you." The psychological impact of her quiet, absolute refusal was catastrophic for Preston. His entire strategy of weaponized intimidation relied heavily on the target exhibiting fear compliance or chaotic anger. He had physically cornered her, verbally insulted her background, and deployed blatant, loudly projected racist microaggressions in front of an audience of the city elite. He expected her to shatter. He expected her to frantically beg for his approval or scream loud enough for him to justify calling the police. Instead, she had just calmly evaluated his malicious attack as a pathetic operational failure and dismissed him entirely. The cognitive dissonance violently fractured Preston's fragile ego. His perfectly groomed facade completely evaporated, instantly replaced by the raw, unhinged volatility of a desperate man rapidly losing control of his own perceived territory. The smug, victorious smirk vanished from his lips. The blood rushed violently to his face, turning his pale complexion a mottled, sickly shade of furious crimson. He was a petty tyrant whose absolute authority had just been openly, effortlessly rejected by a black woman he considered fundamentally beneath him. Preston completely lost his physical and professional composure. His breathing became ragged and highly audible. He leaned forward aggressively, invading her personal airspace. With a sudden violent burst of uncontrolled kinetic energy, he slammed both of his manicured hands squarely down onto the edge of her small table. The heavy physical impact sent a violent shockwave through the wooden surface. The crystal water goblet shook violently, spilling cold water onto the linen. The heavy sterling silver cutlery rattled aggressively against the fine bone china, a sharp metallic clattering that echoed like a gunshot across the vaulted gold leaf ceilings. "Eat the scraps you were given, and pay the bill," Preston hissed, his voice trembling with sheer, unadulterated malice. The loud theatrical projection was completely gone, replaced by a venomous, highly aggressive whisper meant to terrorize her into immediate submission. "Or I will have my private security physically drag you out to the pavement, where people like you actually belong." He remained leaning over the table, his arms locked straight, towering over her seated figure in a textbook display of physical predatory intimidation. He was desperately attempting to use his physical bulk to crush her terrifyingly calm aura. The visual contrast was staggering to behold. Preston was vibrating with fragile theatrical rage, a man completely consumed by his own toxic prejudice, desperately weaponizing his hospitality title. Vivian remained entirely motionless beneath him. She did not lean back in her chair. She did not flinch at the violent slam of his hands. She maintained unbroken, freezing eye contact, observing his emotional collapse with the detached clinical fascination of a forensic auditor identifying a fatal structural flaw in a bankrupt company. The violent acoustic disruption of Preston slamming the table acted as a powerful catalyst for the surrounding aristocratic audience. The heavy, oppressive silence of the main dining room was instantly shattered. The wealthy, predominantly white patrons who had been eagerly watching the confrontation unfold suddenly felt empowered to actively participate in the public degradation. They recognized Preston's absolute loss of control, and instead of condemning his highly aggressive behavior, their deeply ingrained systemic biases instantly rallied to protect him. They viewed Vivian not as a victim of blatant discrimination, but as a hostile, disruptive invader who was actively ruining their exclusive, heavily gated atmospheric experience. At the adjacent table, Caroline eagerly seized the opportunity to inject herself directly into the center of the conflict. She completely abandoned her decadent steaming lobster. She leaned her upper body aggressively across the negative space, separating their tables, her face flushed with the toxic, euphoric thrill of weaponized white privilege. She bypassed Vivian entirely, directly addressing the violently shaking general manager. "Do not waste another single second arguing with her, Preston." Caroline projected loudly, her shrill, highly abrasive voice easily cutting through the ambient noise of the industrial kitchen. She is clearly trying to run a scam to get a free meal. I have seen this exact type of aggressive behavior before. These people come into respectable establishments, cause a massive, chaotic scene, and refuse to pay their bills. You are being far too lenient with her. Caroline's words were a highly orchestrated deployment of the most dangerous, historically weaponized stereotypes available. She was actively using her status as a wealthy white socialite to completely reframe the narrative of the room. She was deliberately transforming Vivian from a paying customer who was just served rotting biohazardous waste into a criminal scammer, a direct physical and financial threat to the safety of the restaurant. Caroline was executing the ultimate Karen maneuver, rallying the systemic power of the physical crowd to completely crush the isolated minority target. Her husband, the balding finance executive, finally looked up from his premium Wagyu beef. He nodded his head in vigorous, cowardly agreement, his face tight with elitist disgust. "She is completely right, Preston," the husband chimed in, his voice thick with unearned authority. "This is a private members-only institution. We pay incredibly high premium dues specifically to ensure we do not have to interact with this specific demographic. Call the police immediately and have her arrested for trespassing and theft of services. She is severely disturbing the peace of the entire dining room." The mob mentality violently accelerated, spreading outward from Caroline's table like a toxic airborne contagion. The hushed aristocratic murmurs of the surrounding tables rapidly escalated into loud, highly aggressive declarations of solidarity with the general manager. Dozens of wealthy patrons began openly muttering their agreement. A woman 2 tables away loudly complained that her expensive dining experience was being completely ruined by the aggressive outsider. A man in a tailored worsted wool suit shouted that security should have never let her through the heavy brass doors in the first place. The physical environment of the Aurelia closed in around Vivian with suffocating atmospheric pressure. The psychological rubber band was now stretched to the absolute breaking point. She was entirely surrounded by a deeply hostile, highly aggressive collective of wealthy individuals who were actively demanding her immediate physical removal and potential legal arrest. They were judging her net worth, her character, and her fundamental human dignity based entirely on the dark color of her skin and the unbranded cashmere of her tracksuit. They were entirely united in their absolute unwavering belief that she was powerless, poor, and utterly defenseless against their combined systemic authority. Vivian processed the cascading wave of mob hostility with a profound, almost terrifying level of emotional detachment. She did not feel fear. She did not feel the crushing, desperate isolation that Preston and Caroline were working so diligently to manufacture. She simply felt a profound, overwhelming sense of clarity. She was currently witnessing the absolute worst, most deeply ingrained failures of modern societal privilege, entirely unfiltered and proudly displayed in high definition. She recognized that this was not merely a customer service dispute. This was a hostile corporate environment that required immediate catastrophic restructuring. Preston completely fed off the aggressive vocal support of his wealthy patrons. The loud validation from Caroline and the surrounding tables acted as a massive infusion of artificial confidence, instantly repairing his violently fractured ego. He stood up straight, pulling his hands off the table, his chest puffed out with total, absolute arrogance. He firmly believed the battle was completely won. The crowd had unanimously ruled in his favor. He had successfully isolated the target, stripped her of her basic dignity, and secured the complete blessing of his elite clientele to deploy physical force. He looked down at Vivian with a smile of pure venomous triumph. "You heard my highly valued guests." Preston sneered, his voice dripping with condescending victory. "Your pathetic little scam has completely failed. You are severely trespassing on private, heavily restricted property, and your time here is completely over." Preston slowly turned his head away from Vivian, looking out across the sprawling, multi-tiered amphitheater of the main dining room. His eyes locked onto the distant heavy brass doors of the grand foyer. Standing entirely motionless by the deep burgundy velvet ropes were the two towering, heavily muscled security guards, dressed in their immaculate dark suits. Preston raised his right hand high above his shoulder, ensuring the physical gesture was highly visible to everyone in the room. He extended his index and middle fingers, violently snapping them together twice in rapid succession. It was a sharp, authoritative command signal. He then pointed his finger directly across the room, aggressively locking the target squarely onto Vivian. The response was immediate and highly coordinated. The two massive security guards instantly broke their passive perimeter stance. They stepped away from the velvet ropes and began to move with rapid, heavy tactical precision directly through the center of the main dining room. They did not walk. They marched. Their heavy tactical boots thudded rhythmically against the imported hardwood floor, a deep, menacing acoustic bass line that signaled the imminent arrival of physical violence. As they navigated through the tightly packed luxury tables, the wealthy patrons eagerly leaned back in their leather chairs, physically clearing the pathway, their faces completely illuminated with toxic, predatory anticipation. They were eagerly waiting for the grand finale. They wanted to see the black woman in the cheap gray tracksuit physically manhandled, violently dragged out of her chair and humiliated on the public pavement outside. The ticking clock in Vivian's mind registered exactly 19 minutes remaining before her global acquisition call. The massive security personnel were exactly 40 feet away and rapidly closing the distance. The digital livestream broadcasting from Maya's phone across the room had just violently breached 8,000 concurrent viewers, the chat interface completely exploding with sheer, unadulterated digital panic. The heavy, oppressive air of the restaurant was completely frozen, the tension so incredibly thick it felt physically suffocating. Preston stood with his arms crossed over his chest, blocking her only physical exit path, waiting for his muscle to arrive and forcefully execute his deeply racist command. He firmly believed he was the absolute master of his domain, entirely unaware that the quiet, motionless woman sitting in front of him was about to execute a legal and financial maneuver so devastatingly powerful it would permanently erase his entire professional existence from the face of the earth. The heavy tactical boots of the two massive security guards struck the imported hardwood floor with a terrifying synchronized rhythm. Each step acted as a violent acoustic hammer, driving the tension in the segregated dining corner toward an absolute breaking point. The wealthy aristocratic patrons of the Aurelia physically cleared the pathway, pulling their tailored worsted wool suits and expensive silk dresses out of the way, their faces illuminated with a deeply toxic, predatory anticipation. They were entirely captivated by the impending physical violence, eager to witness the forced removal of a black woman they had collectively decided did not belong in their heavily gated sanctuary. Preston stood towering over the small table, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his face locked into a mask of smug, venomous triumph. He firmly believed the psychological warfare was completely over. He believed he had successfully utilized the systemic power of his environment to completely crush her. Directly across the sprawling expanse of the main dining room, sitting quietly in a curved leather booth, Maya watched her smartphone screen with absolute, breathless shock. The digital reality of the situation had violently severed itself from the physical ignorance of the restaurant. The social media algorithm, identifying the incredibly stark visual contrast of the confrontation and the highly polarizing audio of Preston's discriminatory gaslighting, had completely weaponized the live broadcast. The viewer count metric located in the top corner of the glowing interface did not just climb, it exploded. The numbers spun with a terrifying exponential velocity, completely blurring as the broadcast achieved massive global virality. 10,000 viewers, 25,000 viewers, 40,000 concurrent viewers. And then right as the massive security personnel closed within 20 feet of Vivian's table, the digital metric violently smashed through the 50,000 viewer threshold. 50,000 human beings across the entire globe were currently staring through the digital lens, holding their collective breath. The chat interface was moving so incredibly fast that individual words were entirely unreadable, creating a solid scrolling waterfall of sheer unadulterated societal outrage. The digital crowd was completely unified in their absolute fury. They recognized the rotting biohazardous waste sitting on the ceramic plate. They heard the loud, deeply racist microaggressions Preston had proudly projected into the acoustic architecture of the room. They saw the wealthy socialite Caroline laughing in the background, desperately clutching her expensive designer handbag. The internet had instantly transformed into a massive, highly vocal jury, and they were screaming for immediate catastrophic corporate intervention. They were actively identifying the architectural details of the room, cross-referencing the uniform of the waiter, and rapidly triangulating the exact geographic location of the flagship restaurant. Preston was entirely unaware that he was no longer managing a private dining room in Manhattan. He was currently standing trial in front of a global audience of 50,000 people who were actively orchestrating his total professional destruction. As the physical threat of the massive security guards loomed closer, the psychological atmosphere inside the restaurant became completely suffocating. The air felt incredibly thick, heavy with the oppressive weight of unchecked privilege and impending physical assault. But Vivian Sterling remained an absolute fortress of terrifying, untouchable calm. She did not exhibit a single micro-expression of fear. Her heart rate did not elevate. Her breathing remained perfectly regulated, drawing slow, measured breaths that completely ignored the nauseating stench of the rotting fish seeping onto the white linen tablecloth. She had spent 40 years navigating the most ruthless, cutthroat corporate boardrooms on the planet. She had faced down aggressive billionaire hedge fund managers, hostile government regulators, and highly manipulative corporate raiders who possessed infinitely more systemic power than a petty middle management restaurant employee. She viewed the approaching security guards not as a legitimate physical threat, but merely as a highly actionable legal liability. If they laid a single hand on her bespoke cashmere tracksuit, they would instantly upgrade the situation from a civil rights violation to a massive multi-million-dollar assault and battery lawsuit, securing the absolute financial ruin of the entire parent conglomerate. Preston leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto her face, eagerly waiting for the inevitable moment her composure would finally shatter. He wanted the panic. He desperately needed the fear. He needed her to physically cower or violently explode to validate the extreme measures he had just authorized. Vivian looked directly up into his pale blue eyes. And then very slowly, the corners of her mouth began to lift. It was not a smile of genuine amusement. It was not a defensive, nervous reaction. It was a terrifyingly cold, highly calculated expression of absolute corporate lethality. It was the specific, chilling smile of an apex predator that had just quietly closed the heavy steel doors of a trap the prey did not even realize it had walked into. The smile did not reach her eyes. Her gaze remained completely flat dead and deeply analytical. It was the ultimate weapon of the silent wealth persona, a physical manifestation of supreme, untouchable power that completely short-circuited Preston's aggressive expectations. The smug arrogance on Preston's face violently faltered. The sudden appearance of that chilling, polite smile deeply unsettled his fragile ego. It defied all standard psychological logic. She was completely isolated, surrounded by a highly hostile mob with physical force literally seconds away from grabbing her, and yet she was smiling at him with the cold, detached pity of a god looking down at a particularly foolish insect. A sharp, incredibly uncomfortable spike of cognitive dissonance shot through his nervous system. Vivian folded her hands elegantly together on the edge of the table, resting them entirely clear of the biohazardous fluid leaking from the plate. Her voice cut through the ambient noise of the approaching security boots with terrifying crystalline precision. I understand, Vivian stated, her tone incredibly quiet, but heavily weighted with an undeniable gravitational authority. You believe this plate reflects my worth. She delivered the signature phrase with the slow, deliberate cadence of a judge reading a terminal sentence. She did not raise her voice to compete with the chaotic acoustics of the room. She forced him to listen to her. She was actively acknowledging his deeply racist, highly calculated insult, completely stripping away the fake culinary gaslighting he had attempted to hide behind. She was looking directly into his prejudiced soul and confirming that she fully recognized the exact nature of his attack. But the terrifying coldness of her delivery heavily implied that his assessment of her worth was the single greatest, most catastrophic miscalculation of his entire pathetic existence. Preston physically recoiled from the sheer intensity of her words, taking a highly defensive half-step backward. His brain scrambled desperately to regain the aggressive upper hand. The wealthy patrons around them were still watching. Caroline was still eagerly waiting for the grand finale, and he could not allow this black woman to establish any form of psychological dominance in his own dining room. He resorted to the only pathetic defense mechanism he had left, reverting immediately to loud theatrical mockery designed to publicly degrade her economic status. He let out a sharp, highly abrasive scoff, puffing his tailored chest out and intentionally projecting his voice for the surrounding audience to hear. "What exactly do you think you understand?" Preston sneered, his voice dripping with venomous, unchecked malice. "You are about to be physically ejected from the premises. Are you going to sit there and smile while my security team drags you out the front door? Go ahead and call someone. What are you going to do? Are you calling your caseworker to come pick you up?" The racist, economically degrading insult echoed sharply through the segregated corner. It was a desperate, highly offensive attempt to reassert the artificial hierarchy he so desperately relied upon. Caroline let out another loud, shrill burst of laughter from the adjacent table, completely validating his toxic behavior. Vivian did not grant his pathetic mockery a verbal response. She simply broke eye contact, completely dismissing his physical presence, and slowly reached her right hand into the deep pocket of her tailored slate-gray trousers. She retrieved her cellular device. It was not a standard, mass-produced smartphone that the general public carried. It was a highly customized, heavily encrypted satellite device encased in a solid block of matte black aerospace-grade titanium. It operated on a private, highly secure network entirely isolated from standard commercial infrastructure, explicitly designed to facilitate the rapid transfer of billions of dollars in global capital without the risk of digital interception. The sheer physical weight and minimalist design of the device radiated an aura of intense, untouchable wealth. Preston narrowed his eyes, tracking the movement of her hand, a sudden, inexplicable feeling of deep unease washing over his heavily fragranced body. The heavy security guards were now less than 10 feet away, their massive frames casting long, dark shadows across the pristine white tablecloth. The physical window for Vivian to avoid a highly violent public ejection was rapidly closing to a matter of seconds. Vivian unlocked the encrypted interface with a biometric scan of her thumb. She did not frantically scroll through a contact list. She did not open a public review application to type a complaint. She pressed a single dedicated hardware button located on the side of the titanium casing. The device instantly connected directly to the private earpiece of her led corporate acquisitions director, a highly ruthless financial architect currently sitting in a glass-walled office in a private equity skyscraper exactly 12 blocks away. She raised the heavy titanium device to her ear. The entire dining room seemed to hold its collective breath. The heavy acoustic silence broken only by the final echoing footsteps of the security personnel stepping up directly behind her chair. Preston crossed his arms tighter, his face contorted into a mask of desperate, fragile authority, eagerly waiting to hear her plead for help from whatever pathetic local contact he assumed she was calling. Vivian spoke into the encrypted receiver. Her voice was the absolute epitome of corporate lethality, entirely devoid of any emotional fluctuation, carrying the cold mechanical precision of a military drone strike authorization. "Execute the Aurelia Clause," Vivian ordered. The words hung in the suffocating air of the dining room, heavily layered with specialized high-stakes corporate terminology that Preston could barely begin to comprehend. The Aurelia Clause was not a simple legal threat. It was a highly classified, pre-authorized financial contingency plan that her private equity firm had meticulously drafted 6 months prior during a routine evaluation of the hospitality group's heavily leveraged debt profile. Vivian Sterling already owned a massive amount of the parent company's mezzanine debt through a series of anonymous shell corporations. The clause was a financial guillotine waiting only for her verbal command to instantly convert that highly leveraged debt into absolute controlling equity. Full hostile takeover. Vivian continued, her voice slicing through the heavy tension like a scalpel. The security guard standing directly behind her suddenly hesitated. The lead guard, a massive man with a thick neck and a highly trained ear for identifying actual authority, instinctively paused his forward momentum. The terrifying absolute calm in Vivian's voice completely contradicted the standard profile of a trespasser. He looked over Vivian's head directly at Preston, seeking visual confirmation to proceed with the physical ejection, but Preston was currently frozen in place. The color was rapidly beginning to drain from the general manager's perfectly tanned face. The specific legal phrase, "full hostile takeover," had violently pierced through his arrogant armor, triggering a deep primal panic within his corporate-conditioned brain. Liquidate the current management hierarchy, Vivian stated. She enunciated every single syllable with brutal, unyielding clarity. She was not firing him. Firing was a standard human resources procedure. Liquidation was the absolute permanent destruction of an entire corporate structure. She was ordering the immediate termination of the regional directors, the executive board members, and every single parasitic gatekeeper who allowed a culture of systemic racism to flourish within the organization. She was tearing the entire fortress down to its foundation. Effective immediately. Vivian lowered the heavy titanium device from her ear and placed it gently onto the table, resting it directly next to the plate of rotting biohazardous fish. She did not end the call. The encrypted connection remained open, ensuring that her corporate acquisitions team could hear the exact audio of the impending aftermath. The digital livestream broadcasting from across the room was completely detonating. The viewer count held steady at an astronomical 55,000 concurrent viewers. The chat interface was exploding with absolute euphoric catharsis. The digital audience immediately recognized the heavy corporate jargon. They realized they were not just watching a customer service dispute. They were witnessing a live, highly coordinated corporate execution. The comments shifted from expressions of outrage to sheer, unadulterated awe, flooding the screen with declarations of absolute respect for the terrifyingly calm black woman who had just weaponized her massive financial portfolio against a racist bully. Inside the physical reality of the segregated dining corner, a profound, highly unstable silence descended upon the space. The ticking clock in Vivian's mind registered exactly 17 minutes remaining before her multi-billion-dollar global conference call. She had successfully initiated the complete acquisition of a luxury hospitality conglomerate in exactly 15 seconds, utilizing less effort than it took Caroline to order her steaming lobster. Preston Kensington stood entirely paralyzed, his arms slowly uncrossed, dropping limply to his sides, the expensive fabric of his bespoke charcoal suit suddenly looking incredibly heavy and profoundly foolish. His brain was desperately trying to process the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic error he had just committed. The cognitive dissonance was completely shattering his reality. He looked from the heavy titanium phone resting on the table up to the terrifyingly calm face of the black woman he had just aggressively threatened, and finally to the two massive security guards who were now standing awkwardly behind her, entirely unsure of who was actually in command of the room. The smug, victorious smirk was permanently erased from Preston's face, replaced entirely by the cold, creeping dread of a man who suddenly realizes he is standing on the tracks of an incoming freight train. The rubber band of the psychological conflict had violently snapped, and the absolute devastating weight of the silent wealth climax was about to completely crush him. The massive lead security guard closed the final remaining distance between himself and the small wooden table. He raised his heavily muscled right arm, extending a thick, calloused hand directly toward the shoulder of Vivian Sterling. The physical distance between his aggressive, uninvited touch and the pristine $6,000 bespoke cashmere fabric of her tracksuit was now measured in mere millimeters. In the background, the rhythmic clattering of the industrial kitchen seemed to entirely mute itself, completely overpowered by the suffocating heavy anticipation radiating from the wealthy patrons. Preston Kensington stood just a few feet away, his perfectly manicured hands resting confidently on his hips. A dark, deeply venomous smile of absolute triumph was permanently plastered across his pale face. He was entirely intoxicated by the imminent deployment of physical force. He firmly believed he had successfully orchestrated the ultimate humiliation of a woman he had racially profiled and systematically degraded. At the adjacent table, the wealthy socialite Caroline leaned forward so aggressively that her silk designer dress strained against her posture, her eyes wide with toxic predatory excitement, eagerly waiting for the physical violent climax she had actively cheered for. Then a catastrophic acoustic disruption violently shattered the atmosphere of the dining room. The sound was not a subtle interruption. It was an explosive, concussive boom that physically rattled the crystal water goblets resting on the linen tablecloths. The massive, solid brass front doors of the Aurelia doors that were meticulously engineered to open with a slow, heavy aristocratic silence were violently thrust apart from the outside. The heavy brass struck the imported limestone walls of the grand foyer with a deafening crash. The two towering security guards assigned to the velvet ropes were physically shoved aside, completely overpowered by the sheer aggressive momentum of the individuals entering the building. The lead security guard standing over Vivian instantly froze, his hand hovering statically in the air, his tactical training violently overriding his current orders. Every single privileged, judgmental eye in the sprawling amphitheater of the dining room simultaneously snapped away from the segregated corner and locked onto the grand foyer. 5 individuals marched through the threshold. They were not local law enforcement officers responding to a manufactured trespassing dispute. They were not regional hospitality managers arriving for a routine operational audit. They were the apex predators of the global financial ecosystem. This was the highly elusive, notoriously ruthless parent company board of directors for the Aurelia Global Hospitality Group. They moved with a terrifying synchronized urgency, completely ignoring the deeply ingrained social protocols of the restaurant. They did not wait to be seated by the frightened hostess. They did not offer polite smiles to the wealthy clientele. They marched in a strict aggressive V formation directly across the main dining floor. These were men who controlled tens of billions of dollars in international real estate and luxury assets. They wore immaculate custom-tailored Savile Row suits constructed from the finest worsted wool, carrying heavy leather briefcases that contained the legal architecture of entire corporate empires. At the front of the formation walked Harrison Thorne, the chief executive officer and chairman of the board. Harrison was a man who permanently resided in the upper echelons of extreme wealth, a man whose mere physical presence usually commanded immediate silent reverence from anyone in the corporate sector. Yet as he marched violently through the dining room, his physical appearance was completely stripped of its usual arrogant composure. His face was flushed with sheer, unadulterated terror. He was actively sweating, breathing heavily, his highly expensive silk tie slightly askew, radiating the desperate, frantic energy of a man who had just watched his entire multi-billion-dollar empire catch fire. Preston instantly recognized the chairman. The venomous, triumphant smile on the general manager's face evaporated so quickly it appeared as though it had been physically wiped away. His arrogant posture violently snapped into a rigid, deeply subservient stance. The petty tyrant who had just spent the last 40 minutes terrorizing a black woman instantly reverted into a terrified, sycophantic middle management employee. Preston firmly believed the board of directors was executing a surprise operational inspection. He frantically smoothed the lapels of his charcoal suit, stepped away from Vivian's table, and practically sprinted forward to intercept the approaching executives, eager to demonstrate his absolute control over the current security situation. Mr. Thorne Preston projected, his voice cracking slightly, pitching up into a desperate, highly nervous register. "Welcome to the flagship location, sir. I deeply apologize for the current chaotic disruption you are witnessing. We are currently in the process of forcibly removing a highly aggressive trespasser who has been threatening the staff and disturbing our premium guests." Preston extended his hand, fully expecting the chairman to stop to validate his aggressive management tactics and to commend him for aggressively protecting the exclusive brand identity of the establishment. Harrison Thorne did not stop. He did not slow down. He did not even look at Preston. The chairman of the board physically brushed past his own general manager with such violent, dismissive force that Preston's shoulder was jolted backward. Harrison treated Preston with the exact same level of spatial awareness one might give to a misplaced coat rack. The other four senior executives followed immediately behind, completely ignoring the stuttering, deeply confused manager, their eyes locked entirely onto the dark, segregated corner of the room. Preston spun around, his mouth hanging open in completely silent, uncomprehending shock. He watched entirely paralyzed as the five most powerful men in his corporate universe marched directly up to the incredibly small, unstable table positioned aggressively close to the noisy kitchen doors. The massive lead security guard, recognizing the supreme absolute authority radiating from the executives, instantly dropped his hand, taking 3 rapid steps backward, physically removing himself from the immediate vicinity of the cashmere tracksuit. Harrison Thorne stopped directly in front of Vivian Sterling. He looked down at the biohazardous rotting gray fish leaking greasy fluid onto the pristine white tablecloth. He looked at the deeply offensive segregated location of her table. Then the multi-billionaire chief executive officer did something that completely shattered the deeply ingrained racist hierarchy of the entire room. He bowed. It was not a subtle nod of corporate acknowledgement. It was a deep, highly respectful, incredibly subservient physical bow, lowering his head and his shoulders in a profound display of absolute submission before the 62-year-old black woman sitting quietly in her unbranded gym clothes. Miss Sterling, Harrison Thorne projected. His voice was loud, carrying clearly across the absolute deathly silence of the main dining room. He intentionally bypassed any form of standard hospitality greeting, immediately deploying the heavy, punishing corporate and legal terminology required of the moment. "I have received direct confirmation from our International Legal Counsel and the Federal Exchange Commission. The emergency Aurelia clause has been successfully and fully executed across all global markets. The entirety of our corporate mezzanine debt has been violently converted into controlling shares. The legal transfer of assets is absolutely complete." Harrison stood back up, his voice shaking slightly under the terrifying weight of the financial reality he was actively confirming. "Ms. Sterling, you now possess 80% controlling equity of Aurelia Global Hospitality Group. You own the foundational real estate, the international brand licensing, and every single subsidiary asset contained within this portfolio. We are here strictly to await your immediate executive commands." The psychological shockwave that detonated across the dining room was physically palpable. The acoustic environment of the Aurelia experienced a total catastrophic vacuum of sound. The wealthy patrons stopped breathing. The string quartet had ceased playing minutes ago. The clattering of the industrial kitchen had been completely silenced by the terrified culinary staff peering through the metal porthole windows. For Preston Kensington, the arrival of reality was not a gradual realization. It was a sudden, violent, total physiological collapse. The blood drained so rapidly from Preston's face that his skin took on a sickly, translucent, almost gray pallor. His perfectly manicured hands began to tremble violently, completely losing their rigid, arrogant control. His knees actually buckled slightly beneath the weight of his expensive charcoal suit, forcing him to reach out and blindly grab the edge of an empty dining chair simply to remain standing. His brain violently short-circuited, desperately attempting to process the absolute apocalyptic magnitude of the information that had just been publicly verified. The woman he had intentionally intercepted at the velvet ropes. The woman he had racially profiled and accused of carrying food stamps. The woman he had intentionally seated next to the garbage disposal route and served rotting biological waste. The woman he had openly mocked, publicly degraded, and actively ordered physical security to violently assault. She did not just have enough money to buy his restaurant. She literally owned his entire existence. She owned the heavy brass doors he so proudly guarded. She owned the gold leaf ceiling above his head. She owned the payroll system that processed his heavily leveraged suburban mortgage. The chilling, terrifyingly polite smile she had given him just moments before suddenly made absolute, devastating sense. It was the smile of an executioner who had already pulled the lever. Preston opened his mouth, desperately gasping for air like a fish thrown onto the hot pavement. He attempted to speak, to formulate some kind of pathetic, backpedaling apology, but his vocal cords completely seized. A pathetic, wet, stuttering sound was the only noise that managed to escape his throat. The systemic karma rippled violently outward from the center of the confrontation, instantly crushing the toxic mob mentality of the surrounding crowd. At the adjacent table, the profound arrogance of the wealthy socialite Caroline completely disintegrated. The woman who had just loudly demanded that Vivian be arrested for trespassing suddenly realized she had been actively mocking and cheering for the physical assault of the absolute sovereign owner of the establishment. The color flushed violently out of Caroline's heavily made-up face. She physically shrank into the tufted leather upholstery of her booth, her posture violently collapsing in on itself. She slowly reached out her shaking diamond-covered hands and entirely released her grip on the rare white Himalayan crocodile Birkin bag, aggressively pushing it away from her body, desperate to suddenly appear, small, quiet, and completely invisible. Her husband sat frozen in absolute terror, staring blankly at his premium Wagyu beef, entirely unwilling to make eye contact with anyone. The elite, highly privileged audience, who had eagerly weaponized their collective racism to protect a middle management bully, now sat in terrified, paralyzed silence. They were trapped in a deeply uncomfortable, heavily gated sanctuary that had just been hostilely conquered right in front of their eyes. Vivian Sterling remained seated in her dark corner. She did not stand up to gloat. She did not raise her voice to match the dramatic arrival of her newly acquired corporate board. She simply looked past the terrified chairman, her cold, deeply analytical eyes locking directly onto the pale, stuttering, utterly broken form of Preston Kensington. The rubber band had snapped, the ultimate power had been fully revealed, and the absolute destruction of his professional reality had officially begun. Vivian Sterling slowly pushed her deeply uncomfortable wooden chair backward, the harsh, scraping sound of the wooden legs dragging against the imported Calicut marble floor serving as the only acoustic interruption in the completely paralyzed dining room. She stood up to her full commanding height. She did not rush her physical movements. She did not display any of the frantic, sweating, hyperventilating panic that currently consumed the multi-billionaire chairman of the board, standing completely subservient just a few feet away from her table. She calmly reached her perfectly manicured hands down and meticulously adjusted the hem of her bespoke slate-gray cashmere jacket, smoothing out a microscopic wrinkle with absolute terrifying precision. Every single privileged eye in the sprawling amphitheater of the main dining room watched her every breath. She was no longer a faceless black woman in cheap gym clothes to them. She had just violently transformed into the absolute sovereign authority of their entire highly curated universe. Harrison Thorne, the chairman of the board, instinctively took a deep, highly respectful step backward, physically yielding the executive floor to his new commanding officer. He kept his head slightly bowed, his expensive leather briefcase hanging heavily at his side, absolutely terrified to interrupt the incoming corporate execution. The four other senior executives standing in the tight formation completely mirrored his submissive posture. They recognized that Vivian was about to perform a highly necessary, entirely ruthless corporate cleansing, and they were perfectly content to let the arrogant general manager take the absolute brunt of her legendary wrath. Vivian turned her cold, deeply analytical gaze directly onto Preston Kensington. The physical state of the general manager was absolutely pathetic to behold. The man who had proudly puffed his tailored chest out and loudly demanded her physical removal just seconds prior was now actively trembling from head to toe. His perfectly tailored charcoal suit looked visibly wrinkled and incredibly heavy on his rapidly collapsing frame. He was gasping for air in short, ragged, pathetic wheezes, completely unable to formulate a single coherent syllable to defend himself. Vivian began to speak. She did not raise her voice. She did not yell or scream to match the highly chaotic, aggressive energy Preston had previously brought to the table. Her voice was incredibly quiet, flawlessly modulated, projecting the absolute lethal precision of a corporate guillotine slowly dropping directly onto its designated target. Vivian stated her tone entirely devoid of any standard human empathy or warmth. As the newly confirmed majority shareholder and absolute owner of Aurelia Global Hospitality, my very first executive action is a comprehensive, immediate, and highly aggressive operational audit of this specific flagship location. And you, Preston, have just provided me with a spectacular, highly documented display of gross operational negligence. Vivian raised her right hand and gestured gracefully toward the ceramic plate sitting on the white linen tablecloth. By willfully bypassing our standard luxury kitchen protocols, manually retrieving actively decomposing rancid biological waste from a designated discard bin, and intentionally serving it to a paying patron, you have not merely committed a severe lapse in hospitality judgment. You have actively, maliciously violated California Health and Safety Code Section 114004. You have knowingly weaponized biohazardous material within a premium dining establishment. That single action alone is a severe federal health violation that will result in the immediate permanent termination of your hospitality management license and massive crippling corporate fines for this establishment. But you did not stop there, did you? You felt the overwhelming toxic need to publicly humiliate me based on your deeply ingrained pathetic systemic prejudices. Vivian continued her words, slicing cleanly through his shattered ego. By intentionally denying me the equal enjoyment of good services and fundamental human privileges in a place of public accommodation, strictly on the grounds of my race and the perceived color of my skin, you have blatantly and proudly violated Title II of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You did not just insult me personally, Preston. You exposed this entire global corporate conglomerate to a massive, highly publicized multi-million-dollar class action discrimination lawsuit. She took a slow, highly calculated step toward him, forcing him to physically cower backward. In the highly competitive realm of global high finance, we do not care about your petty personal feelings or your fragile, incredibly weak ego. We care exclusively about asset protection and risk management. And right now, looking at your catastrophic, highly illegal actions, I do not see a sophisticated general manager of a Michelin star restaurant. I see a massive, toxic financial liability to my newly acquired asset. You are a walking, breathing, highly arrogant breach of fiduciary duty. Your blatant racism is not just morally repulsive to me, it is completely financially ruinous to my bottom line. And in my corporate empire, financial liabilities are immediately, aggressively, and permanently liquidated. The sheer crushing weight of the advanced legal terminology and the brutal corporate jargon violently crushed whatever remaining microscopic fragments of Preston's ego still existed. He completely and totally shattered. The acoustic environment of the dining room captured the exact pathetic moment his arrogant facade broke. He let out a loud, highly involuntary sob, a pathetic wet sound that completely stripped him of his remaining dignity. His knees gave out entirely, completely failing to support his body weight. He crashed violently down onto the imported Calicut marble floor, landing heavily directly in front of Vivian's bespoke running shoes. He was practically crawling on the ground, his perfectly manicured hands reaching out desperately across the floor, though he was absolutely too terrified to actually make physical contact with her clothing. The tears began to flow freely, streaming rapidly down his pale, sickly cheeks, completely ruining his meticulous grooming and leaving his face a wet, pathetic mess. He looked exactly like a completely broken, terrified child begging for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. Miss Sterling. I am so incredibly sorry. Preston sobbed, his voice completely breaking into a pathetic and high-pitched whine that echoed humiliatingly across the totally silent dining room. Please, you have to completely understand my position. I did not know who you actually were. I thought you were just someone else who wandered in off the street. Please do not liquidate my executive position. I have a massive, highly leveraged mortgage on my house in Connecticut. I have 2 young children enrolled in a highly expensive private academy. If I lose this executive salary and my industry reputation, my entire life is completely over. I will lose everything I have ever worked for. I will publicly apologize to you on the live stream right now. I will do whatever you want me to do. Please, Miss Sterling. I am begging you on my hands and knees for your mercy." The visual contrast in the room was absolutely staggering and deeply satisfying to witness. The wealthy white patrons, including the completely silent and terrified socialite Caroline, sitting absolutely frozen at the adjacent table, watched in sheer, unadulterated horror as the highly powerful gatekeeper of their exclusive sanctuary wept openly and pathetically on the floor. The live stream broadcasting from across the room was actively capturing every single pathetic, sobbing frame of his complete professional and psychological destruction for an audience of over 60,000 highly invested digital viewers. Vivian stood perfectly straight, her posture completely immaculate, looking down at the weeping man with the cold, detached indifference of a marble statue observing a dying insect. Vivian listened to his pathetic babbling, completely selfish pleas for exactly 10 excruciatingly long seconds, intentionally allowing the absolute humiliation of his public breakdown to fully marinate in the minds of every single wealthy patron watching the spectacle. She wanted the entire room to witness exactly what happens when systemic racism collides violently with absolute, untouchable financial power. Vivian slowly turned her head toward the chairman of the board. Harrison Vivian instructed smoothly, "I want you to immediately freeze all of Preston's corporate financial accounts, instantly revoke his digital access credentials, and alert the municipal health department to conduct a full comprehensive sweep of the kitchen." Then she finally looked back down at the weeping manager, her voice delivering the ultimate lethal blow. "Actually," Preston Vivian replied, her words carrying a terrifyingly lethal politeness that completely cut through his chaotic wet sobbing. "It should not matter who I am. You should not have to instantly recognize that I am a multi-billionaire private equity titan in order to treat me with the basic fundamental human dignity required of your hospitality profession. Your frantic apologies are entirely worthless to me because you are not actually sorry for your deeply racist behavior. You are only sorry that you accidentally targeted someone who possessed the absolute financial power to completely destroy your life. You are permanently terminated from this corporation. You will absolutely not receive a severance package. You will absolutely not receive a letter of recommendation for future employment, and my corporate legal team will be contacting you directly regarding the massive civil damages you have intentionally caused to this brand today." Vivian slowly turned her head, completely dismissing his weeping form from her field of vision. She looked directly across the dining space at the two massive, highly trained security guards who were still standing frozen just a few feet away. These were the exact same imposing men that Preston had violently and arrogantly signaled to assault her just moments ago. Now they stood completely at attention, desperately waiting for her command. "Security," Vivian commanded, her voice ringing out through the sprawling amphitheater with absolute, unyielding, and terrifying authority. "Remove this highly disruptive, unemployed trespasser from my property immediately." The massive lead security guard did not hesitate for a single microscopic fraction of a second. His professional allegiance had instantly and completely shifted to the new absolute apex predator of the dining room. He stepped forward with highly aggressive tactical speed, reaching down with his massive hands and violently grabbing Preston by the expensive collar of his ruined charcoal suit. The second heavily muscled guard immediately stepped in and grabbed his other arm with equal physical force. Together they violently hoisted the sobbing, completely broken former general manager off the imported marble floor. Preston thrashed weakly in their iron grip, his highly expensive Italian leather shoes dragging pathetically against the beautiful hardwood floor, as the security team marched him aggressively toward the heavy brass doors of the grand foyer. His pathetic wet cries for mercy echoed loudly through the sprawling amphitheater of the dining room. But they were completely and totally ignored by the wealthy patrons who had actively cheered for his racist behavior just 10 minutes earlier. He was forcefully and violently ejected from his own highly curated corporate kingdom, thrown out onto the harsh, cold concrete pavement of the city street, exactly as he had aggressively threatened to do to Vivian. The heavy brass doors swung shut behind him with a final echoing crash, leaving behind only the rancid smell of the rotting fish and the absolute terrifying, highly respectful silence of a newly conquered corporate empire. The heavy, solid brass doors of the grand foyer slammed completely shut, permanently sealing the violent, humiliating exit of the former general manager. The loud metallic echo reverberated through the sprawling vaulted architecture of the main dining room, acting as the final definitive punctuation mark on Preston's completely ruined professional existence. Inside the segregated corner of the restaurant, an absolute terrifying stillness settled over the physical space. The suffocating, toxic atmosphere of unchecked white privilege that had previously dominated the room had been aggressively, surgically eradicated, instantly replaced by the overwhelming gravitational pull of Vivian Sterling's supreme financial authority. The multi-billionaire chairman of the board, Harrison Thorne, remained standing in a rigid posture of absolute submission, his highly expensive leather briefcase gripped tightly in his sweating hands, eagerly awaiting the next catastrophic wave of corporate restructuring. The wealthy aristocratic patrons who just minutes earlier had eagerly weaponized their collective racism to protect a middle management bully now sat entirely paralyzed in their tufted leather booths. They were completely trapped inside a hostile corporate acquisition, entirely stripped of their systemic power, desperately hoping the new apex predator of the room would not suddenly turn her lethal, analytical gaze upon them. Vivian did not acknowledge the terrified audience immediately. She slowly turned her head, her cold eyes scanning the perimeter of the silent industrial kitchen doors. She was actively searching for the single operational variable in the entire establishment that had not actively participated in her public degradation. She found him standing perfectly still in the shadows of the service corridor. Elijah, the young black waiter, was completely frozen in place. He was still holding a heavy silver serving tray against his chest, his impeccably starched white uniform jacket catching the dim light of the kitchen entryway. His dark eyes were incredibly wide, completely overwhelmed by the sheer apocalyptic magnitude of the corporate execution he had just witnessed. He had watched the arrogant, abusive general manager who had tormented him and countless other minority employees for years get legally and physically destroyed in a matter of seconds. He looked at Vivian, not just as a wealthy patron, but as a terrifying, awe-inspiring force of absolute systemic justice. Vivian looked directly at the young man, and for the first time since she had walked through the heavily guarded velvet ropes, the terrifying cold edge of her executive persona softened by a single microscopic fraction. She recognized the profound intelligence, the highly disciplined restraint, and the quiet dignity he had displayed when Preston had aggressively berated him. She recognized a younger version of herself, a highly capable black professional forced to navigate the suffocating toxic waters of a corporate hierarchy designed entirely to keep him at the absolute bottom. In the ruthless world of extreme high finance, Vivian did not just punish toxic liabilities. She actively identified elevated and heavily capitalized raw potential. Elijah, Vivian stated, her voice projecting clearly across the silent room, carrying a totally different, highly constructive frequency. Please step forward and approach this table. Elijah swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet space. He slowly lowered the silver serving tray onto a nearby service station and walked carefully across the imported Calicut marble floor. He stopped a highly respectful distance from her bespoke running shoes, keeping his posture perfectly straight, reverting entirely to his highly trained professional discipline despite the absolute chaos of the moment. Yes, Miss Sterling, Elijah replied, his baritone voice steady but carrying a deep, undeniable undercurrent of profound respect. How may I be of service to you? Vivian looked at him, her highly analytical mind instantly drafting a binding verbal corporate contract. You have just demonstrated an incredibly rare, highly valuable executive asset, Vivian explained smoothly. When you were placed in a deeply hostile, operationally volatile environment actively managed by a deeply prejudiced superior, you did not completely lose your professional composure. You maintained your fundamental dignity. You attempted to provide equitable service in a system deliberately designed to prevent it. That is not the behavioral profile of a junior service employee. That is the exact psychological profile of an apex corporate leader. Vivian turned her head slightly, locking her cold gaze back onto the sweating chairman of the board. Harrison, Vivian instructed, her voice dropping back into the lethal, unyielding register of a corporate mandate. You will immediately execute a full administrative override on the current human resources payroll system. As of this exact second, Elijah is no longer a junior waiter. He is officially promoted to the position of interim general manager of the Aurelia flagship location. He possesses absolute, undisputed operational authority over this entire building and every single employee currently standing inside of it. Harrison Thorne nodded frantically, completely desperate to demonstrate his absolute compliance. Yes, Ms. Sterling, the chairman stammered quickly, his manicured hands fumbling slightly as he mentally prepared to execute the aggressive structural elevation. It will be done immediately. The digital paperwork will be generated within the hour. And regarding his compensation package, Vivian continued, turning her attention back to the completely stunned young man standing before her. You will immediately calculate the absolute maximum salary bracket previously provided to Preston Kensington. You will take that exact numerical figure and you will double it. That is Elijah's new base operational salary, effective retroactively for the current pay period. Furthermore, he is to be immediately enrolled in the Elite Executive Management Training Program at the parent corporate headquarters, fully funded by the company. He will be given every single institutional resource required to permanently succeed in this industry. Elijah physically staggered backward a half step, the sheer, unimaginable weight of the sudden financial and professional elevation completely shocking his nervous system. His breathing hitched sharply. The systemic barrier that had actively suppressed his entire career had not just been broken, it had been completely vaporized by a woman who commanded billions of dollars with a single breath. He looked at Vivian, his eyes shimmering with a profound, overwhelming mixture of sheer disbelief and absolute, unadulterated gratitude. "Thank you, Ms. Sterling," Elijah whispered, his voice completely failing to capture the massive emotional earthquake happening inside his chest. "I will not fail this asset. I will completely restructure this operational culture." "I know you will," Vivian replied quietly, offering him a single highly respectful nod of her head. Vivian then slowly pivoted her entire body, physically turning her back on the segregated dim corner of the restaurant. She faced the sprawling, multi-tiered amphitheater of the main dining room. The incredibly wealthy, highly privileged audience of white socialites, finance executives, and hedge fund managers shrank collectively under her sweeping, terrifying gaze. She looked directly at Caroline, the wealthy socialite who was still pressing herself desperately into the tufted leather booth, her face completely drained of color, entirely stripped of her loud, weaponized Karen persona. Vivian did not address Caroline individually. She addressed the entire deeply flawed, highly toxic corporate architecture of the establishment. She was about to execute the final, most devastating phase of her hostile takeover. She was going to completely dismantle the systemic exclusivity that the wealthy patrons relied upon to feel superior. To the remaining patrons of this establishment, Vivian projected her voice, ringing out with crystal clear, highly punishing corporate authority. "You have historically paid incredibly exorbitant membership dues to maintain the fragile, pathetic illusion that you exist in an entirely separate, vastly superior reality from the rest of the general public. You have heavily subsidized a highly toxic corporate culture that actively profiles, degrades, and physically threatens marginalized individuals simply to protect your deeply insecure egos. That era of systemic gatekeeping is officially permanently terminated." The wealthy patrons stared at her in absolute terrified silence, completely unable to comprehend the massive cultural destruction she was actively authorizing. Harris and Vivian commanded, gesturing broadly across the expansive dining floor. "You will immediately draft a global press release and contact our primary legal counsel. As of tomorrow morning, the Aurelia completely strips its private members-only charter. The heavy velvet ropes outside are to be permanently dismantled. We are completely dissolving the private membership registry. This establishment is immediately transitioning to a fully public open reservation system. We will no longer operate as a heavily guarded fortress for the fragile elite." A collective, highly suppressed gasp rippled through the dining room. Caroline physically clutched her chest, completely devastated by the realization that her incredibly rare, highly coveted social status symbol had just been instantly eradicated by a single executive order. The absolute exclusivity of the Aurelia, the single driving factor of its massive global appeal, was being completely destroyed intentionally by its new owner. Furthermore, Vivian continued, her voice accelerating with relentless, crushing momentum. "We will be executing a massive philanthropic restructuring of the corporate equity distribution. Moving forward in perpetuity, exactly 50% of all gross operational profits generated by this flagship location will be instantly diverted into a newly established, heavily capitalized trust fund. This fund will be utilized exclusively to provide full-ride culinary and hospitality management scholarships for underprivileged minority youth residing in the inner city. We are going to aggressively take the massive wealth generated by this highly elitist room and use it entirely to completely replace the current demographic of the global hospitality industry." The sheer scale of the systemic karma was absolutely staggering. Vivian was not merely punishing one racist manager. She was completely weaponizing the actual financial machinery of the oppressor to actively uplift the exact demographic they had spent decades trying to forcefully exclude. She was transforming a monument to white privilege into a massive, highly efficient economic engine for minority empowerment. And finally, Vivian stated, her cold eyes locking onto the terrified culinary and service staff who were currently huddled near the kitchen doors. "Every single remaining employee within this corporate conglomerate, from the executive board of directors standing in this room, down to the newest junior line cook, will be subjected to a mandatory, highly intensive zero-tolerance bias and discrimination training protocol. Any employee who fails to completely adhere to the newly established equitable operational standards will face immediate permanent liquidation. There will be absolutely no warnings. There will be absolutely no secondary chances. The culture of this asset changes today." Across the massive dining room, sitting quietly in her curved leather booth, Maya stared at the glowing screen of her advanced smartphone. The digital live stream had completely shattered every single viral algorithmic metric the massive social media platform possessed. The live concurrent viewer count violently smashed through the 100,000 barrier and was currently surging past 150,000 highly engaged human beings. The chat interface was completely blinding, moving so fast it appeared as a solid, glowing white blur of sheer, unadulterated societal euphoria. The digital crowd had just witnessed the absolute pinnacle of systemic justice. They had watched a black woman walk into the most hostile, fiercely guarded racist environment in the city, absolutely refuse to be publicly degraded, and systematically buy the entire corporate structure just to tear its prejudiced foundation completely to the ground. They were actively pledging to heavily support the new public restaurant, aggressively sharing the broadcast link, and completely destroying the remaining digital reputation of the former general manager. The catharsis was absolute, totally undeniable, and permanently documented in high-definition reality. Vivian Sterling slowly lifted her left arm, the soft gray cashmere fabric pulling back to reveal the sapphire crystal face of her vintage Patek Philippe complication watch. The sweeping second hand glided silently toward the 12:00 clock position. The highly accelerated, aggressive pacing of the real-world ticking clock had finally reached its ultimate conclusion. She had exactly 2 minutes remaining before the highly encrypted, heavily secured digital gateway opened for her $4 billion corporate acquisition call. Her time in this incredibly petty, localized environment was completely over. She had successfully conquered the room, completely restructured the corporate hierarchy, and permanently destroyed the villain. She looked down one final time at the small, uncomfortable wooden table tucked aggressively into the dark, segregated corner of the dining room. She looked at the incredibly offensive, heavily contaminated ceramic plate. The rancid gray, completely decomposing Chilean sea bass was still actively leaking a highly toxic, greasy fluid onto the pristine white linen tablecloth, the putrid smell of ammonia and biological decay completely clashing with the expensive designer perfumes of the terrified patrons. Vivian did not ask Elijah to clean the table. She did not order the terrified chairman of the board to remove the biohazardous waste. She intentionally left the rotting plate sitting exactly where Preston Kensington had violently slammed it down. It was no longer a personal insult. It was a massive, highly visible monument to his absolute professional destruction. It was a permanent physical reminder to every single wealthy patron and corporate executive in the room that extreme arrogance and systemic prejudice carried a catastrophic financial cost. Vivian Sterling turned her back on the rotting fish, completely dismissing the entire dining room from her highly analytical mind. She adjusted the lapels of her bespoke $6,000 cashmere tracksuit, her posture radiating the supreme, terrifying, untouchable aura of absolute silent wealth. She walked slowly and deliberately across the imported hardwood floor, her custom orthopedics making virtually no sound in the completely silent acoustic environment. The chairman of the board and the senior corporate executives instantly stepped aside, bowing their heads in profound, terrified reverence as the new absolute sovereign of their financial universe passed by. She walked proudly through the grand foyer, passing the terrified security guards, and pushed the heavy, solid brass doors open. She stepped out into the crisp autumn air of the Manhattan pavement, the exact same pavement where Preston had threatened to have her physically dragged, completely ready to ruthlessly liquidate her next $4 billion corporate target. The respect of a human being does not cost a single dime, but the price of arrogance will completely bankrupt you. Have you ever had to bite your tongue while someone abused their petty power against you? Have you ever witnessed blatant discrimination in a place where people were supposed to be treated with absolute dignity? Share your personal story in the comments below because we absolutely read every single one. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of quiet courage rapidly turning into massive, lasting systemic transformation. Because the ultimate revenge is absolutely never getting loud, it is always getting massive, undeniable leverage. The physical manifestation of absolute wealth is completely silent, but its operational impact is undeniably deafening. Consider the catastrophic, highly public professional remains of Preston Kensington. A man who proudly utilized his minimal corporate authority to systematically degrade a black woman ultimately found himself violently expelled onto the unforgiving metropolitan concrete, completely stripped of his title, his income, and his dignity. He operated under the deeply flawed, highly prejudiced assumption that his expensive worsted wool suit and his regional managerial status granted him absolute immunity from basic human decency. He firmly believed his loud, aggressive ignorance was a valid substitute for actual systemic power. On the exact opposite end of the power spectrum, Vivian Sterling did not have to scream. She did not have to shatter crystal glasses, raise her vocal register, or physically flip a dining table to prove her inherent human worth to a hostile audience. She simply recognized a catastrophic organizational liability and leveraged her massive financial portfolio to execute a flawless hostile corporate takeover, permanently liquidating his entire professional existence with a single encrypted phone call. This staggering sequence of events serves as a brutal, undeniable corporate audit of human character. We currently exist in a modern society heavily populated by insecure gatekeepers who desperately weaponize their minor administrative privileges to inflict severe psychological damage upon marginalized individuals. They firmly believe they are completely insulated by the heavily guarded architecture of their exclusive institutions, protected by the structural inequalities of the corporate ladder, and shielded by the silent complicity of their wealthy peers. But the fundamental economic law of systemic justice is completely absolute and entirely unforgiving. The respect of a human being doesn't cost a single dime, but the price of arrogance will bankrupt you. You have highly likely encountered a Preston in your own professional or personal trajectory. The middle management tyrant who intentionally bypassed you for a fully deserved executive promotion. The luxury retail supervisor who aggressively monitored your movements through a department store simply because of your specific demographic profile. The wealthy suburban socialite who loudly questioned your fundamental right to occupy a designated premium space in your own residential neighborhood. The psychological and emotional toll of navigating these incredibly toxic, highly prejudiced environments on a daily basis is extraordinarily heavy and deeply exhausting. Have you ever had to bite your tongue while someone abused their petty power? Share your story in the comments below. We actively read, meticulously analyze, and fiercely validate every single documented experience you provide because your localized daily struggles reflect a much larger, highly critical global narrative of necessary cultural restructuring. We are actively building a highly engaged, fiercely dedicated digital collective committed to entirely dismantling these prejudiced corporate hierarchies from the inside out. We absolutely refuse to allow these daily acts of systemic discrimination to simply fade away into the accepted background noise of everyday corporate life. We demand total accountability and massive financial consequences for bigotry. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of quiet courage turning into lasting systemic transformation. Because the best revenge isn't getting loud, it's getting leverage.